The scream cut across the Wyoming flats like a blade. High and thin and desperate, a sound that belonged to something far too small to be making it. It came from somewhere beyond the next ridge, somewhere hidden in the heat shimmers that danced above the sagebrush, and it reached inside Jack Mercer's chest before his mind had time to decide what to do about it. He pulled the reins left without thinking. The horse turned hard, and Jack let her run. He crested the ridge at a full gallop, and what he saw below him stopped him cold. A girl, 5 years old, maybe 6, standing alone in the dirt with a dead branch held over her head like a weapon. Her dress was the color of dust, her face streaked with dried tears and grime, and her eyes were locked on him with a ferocity that made his breath catch. Behind her, lying motionless on the ground, was a woman. Before we go any further into Emma Wright's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me what city you're watching from today. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. Jack sat still on his horse for a long moment. He let the girl get a good look at him. He kept his hands visible and his face open. Her grip on that branch tightened until her knuckles went white, and she did not lower it. "Don't you come any closer," she said. Her voice was small and raw, but there was nothing small about the weight behind it. Jack raised both palms slow. "Easy now," he said. "I ain't going to hurt you." "That's what the last one said." The words landed like a fist. He went very still. She hadn't moved, still holding that branch aimed at him, her chin lifted in a way that made his chest ache with something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Last ones," he repeated. He kept his voice flat and careful. "How many came through here?" "4." She didn't blink. "They killed my papa. They hurt my mama and took our horses and they left." A beat. "So you need to go away." Jack didn't move. He looked at the woman on the ground behind her. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, barely visible in the harsh noon light. He looked at his canteen, full. He looked at the sun, already brutal, and the empty miles in every direction. He looked at the girl. "What's your name?" he asked. "None of your business." "Fair enough." He shifted in the saddle. "Mine's Jack Mercer. I've got a ranch about 4 miles north of here. Got water, got shade, got a spare room." He paused. "Your mama needs a doctor, miss. The nearest one's in Laramie, a 1.5-day ride from here. I can't bring him to her fast enough, but I can bring her to him." Something flickered across the girl's face, a crack in the armor. "She told me not to leave her." "I know. She said stay right here, no matter what." "How long ago did she say that?" The girl's jaw tightened. 2 days. Jack closed his eyes for a second. This child had stood guard over her unconscious mother for 2 days in Wyoming summer heat, with nothing but a broken branch and an unbreakable will. He opened his eyes. "What's your name?" he asked again, but this time it wasn't a question. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing him with eyes that had seen too much. "Emma," she said at last. "Emma Wright." "Emma." He nodded once. "I need you to trust me for about 10 minutes, that's all. Just 10 minutes. After that, if you decide I'm one of the bad ones, you can hit me with that branch as hard as you want. And I'll deserve it." Emma Wright studied him. She was 5 years old, and she had the eyes of someone who had learned that the world does not hand out mercy without a price. She looked at her mother on the ground. She looked back at Jack. She lowered the branch to her side, but she did not drop it. 10 minutes, she said. "Then I decide." Jack dismounted slow and deliberate, keeping his hands visible. He walked toward the woman and crouched beside her. 2 fingers to the throat. A pulse, weak but present. She was young, maybe 30, with dark circles under her eyes and a gash on her left temple that had bled enough to stain her collar. He didn't look further than he needed to. "Her name's Sarah," Emma said from right behind him. She'd followed without a sound. "Sarah Wright. She's my mama." "How old are you, Emma?" 5 3/4, almost 6. "Does your mama have any other family? Anyone in Laramie?" "No." The word came out flat and final. "It was just us and Papa. And now it's just us." Jack stood slowly. He unpinned his canteen and held it out. Emma stared at it. "Drink," he said. "Mama first. Your mama isn't conscious enough to drink." "She'll get water when I get her stable. You drink now, or you're no good to her." Emma's lower lip pressed flat. She took the canteen, drank 3 long pulls, then made herself stop. She handed it back. "Okay," she said. "What do we do?" Jack had been ranching alone for 8 years. 8 years of riding out at dawn and coming home to a house with 4 rooms and 1 heartbeat. He'd stopped going to town more than he had to. He'd stopped most everything that required sitting across from another human being. He hadn't planned on bringing anyone home. But he looked down at a 5-year-old girl with cracked lips and a broken branch and 2 days of desperate loyalty behind her eyes, and something in his chest shifted. "We ride north," he said. "That's what we do." Getting Sarah onto the horse was no easy task. She was taller than she looked, and even unconscious her body resisted. Emma stood 2 feet away, narrating in a fierce whisper, "Be careful, she's got a bad spot on her side. Don't touch her side, mister." Jack found the bruised ribs himself and adjusted his grip. He settled Sarah across the saddle in front of him, then looked down at Emma. "You ride behind me," he said. "Hold on to my coat and don't let go." "I've never ridden a horse." "That's all right. My horse don't know that." Emma looked at the horse with the same evaluating expression she'd turned on Jack, then held up her arms. He lifted her up behind him one-handed. She grabbed 2 fistfuls of his coat, her knuckles pressing hard into his back. "I've got her," Emma said quietly, meaning her mother. "I know," Jack said. "I've got her too." He pressed his heels in and they rode north. The 4 miles to his ranch felt like the longest ride of his life. He kept one arm locked around Sarah, monitoring her shallow breathing. Emma didn't say a word for the first mile. He could feel her rigid and alert behind him. Then, about 1.5 miles in, exhaustion won a battle she'd been fighting for 2 days. Her grip on his coat went from fierce to heavy, and her forehead dropped against the back of his shoulder. She was asleep before the 2-mile mark. Jack rode carefully the rest of the way. His house needed paint, his barn needed a new board, but the roof held and the spare room had a real bed. He got Sarah inside first. Emma woke the instant the horse stopped and dropped to the ground, landing hard on both feet, still clutching that branch. She followed him through the front door, her eyes moving over everything like she was mapping exits. "This is yours. 8 years now. You live here alone?" "Yep." She looked at the empty fireplace, the single plate on the drying rack, the coat hanging by the door that had been there so long it had become part of the wall. "How come that?" Jack laid Sarah down on the bed in the spare room. "That's a long story for another time." He sent Emma to the kitchen for water while he checked Sarah's injuries in better light. The head wound was the worst. It needed cleaning and wrapping. Her right wrist was swollen, possibly broken. There were bruises on her arms in shapes that tightened something in his jaw, but her breathing deepened now that she was out of the heat. When he pressed gently around her ribs, she stirred and made a sound. "Mama." Emma was back with the water. She crossed the room fast and took her mother's hand. "Mama, I'm right here." Sarah's eyes didn't open, but her fingers found Emma's and held on. Emma exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for 2 days. Jack worked quietly, cleaning the wound, wrapping Sarah's wrist with strips of clean cloth. He'd treated bad falls and horse kicks. He knew enough to know she needed rest, water, food, and time. The head wound would need a doctor's eye eventually, but she wasn't dying tonight. He sat back and let out a slow breath. "She gonna be okay?" Emma asked. "I think so. I believe so." Emma nodded once, very serious, then looked at her mother's face. Something broke briefly, a crack in her expression before she pulled it back. "I didn't cry," she said. "The whole time. I didn't cry because she couldn't see me cry." "I know," Jack said. "She would have worried. I wasn't scared either." Jack looked at her, at the branch still in her hand, at the hollows around her eyes. "No," he said gently. "I don't reckon you were." He fed her that evening. She sat at his kitchen table, which had only ever had 1 chair, so he pulled a crate over and sat on that. She ate the beans and cornbread he made with focused silence that told him she hadn't eaten anything real in as long as her mother had been unconscious. She ate every bite, then looked at the pot. He refilled her bowl without being asked. She looked up at him. "Thank you." Her voice was precise and formal, the way a child says it when they've been taught that it matters. "You're welcome," Jack said. She looked around the kitchen, out the window, back at him. You got any kids? No. You got a wife? The question landed the way that question always did. Not anymore, he said. She die? A few years back. Emma considered this. My papa died 2 days ago, and I don't know what that feels like yet. Mama says sometimes feelings come late. Jack looked at his hands. Your mama's right. They do. Does it stop eventually? He thought about the long answer. It changes, he said finally. It don't stop, but it changes, gets different. Gets something you can carry instead of something that carries you. Emma turned this over in her mind like a stone in her palm. Okay, she said. She slept in the chair beside her mother that night. Jack brought blankets, and she wrapped herself in them without complaint, her back straight and her eyes on Sarah. He stood in the doorway, watching her fight sleep with her whole stubborn self. She lost that fight inside 5 minutes. Her head drooped, her breathing evened out, her grip on the blanket went slack. Jack went to his own room and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He thought about the choice he'd made, though he wasn't sure he'd chosen so much as found himself doing something before his mind caught up. He thought about the empty chairs in his kitchen. He thought about the sound Emma made when her mother's fingers closed around her hand, that vast release, and the way it had moved through him. He sat in his quiet house, which wasn't entirely quiet anymore, and for the first time in 8 years, he didn't feel alone. Sarah Wright opened her eyes on the second morning. Jack heard it happen from the kitchen, a shift in the quality of silence down the hall. He set down his coffee and walked to the doorway. Emma sat bolt upright in her chair, both hands wrapped around her mother's, her eyes wide and wet and fierce. Mama. Just that one word, like a prayer answered. Sarah's eyes were open but unfocused. Her lips moved, nothing came out. Don't try to talk, Jack said. You're safe at a ranch north of where we found you. My name's Jack Mercer. Your daughter's right here. Sarah's eyes found him and sharpened immediately with the hard weariness of a woman who had recent reasons not to trust a strange man's face. He's okay, Mama, Emma said quickly. I checked him out. He's one of the good ones. Something moved across Sarah's face. Her gaze went from Jack to Emma and back again, reading the space between them. Water, Jack said, and helped her drink before she had to ask. She drank slowly, then lay back. My husband, she said, her voice rough. Robert. Emma's grip tightened. Silence answered them both. Sarah closed her eyes, a single long breath moving through her that carried something heavy out with it. She didn't cry. After a while she opened her eyes and looked at her daughter. You stayed. I told you I would. I told you to go find help. You also told me not to trust strangers. Emma lifted her chin. I used my own judgment. Sarah made a sound that might have been a laugh if she'd had the strength. She turned her head to Jack. She judged you acceptable? She gave me 10 minutes to prove myself. I must have scraped by. How long have we been here? This is your second morning. Sarah absorbed that. You brought us here, 2 strangers? Your daughter is extremely persuasive. I didn't say anything persuasive, Emma muttered. I told you to go away. Like I said, Sarah watched them. Her eyes moved over Jack. I'm Jack, he said. Just Jack. She looked at Emma, then back at him. Jack, she said, trying the sound. I need to know what happened to my husband, where they took him, whether there's anything. Mama, Emma's voice was soft. Papa's gone. He's been gone since the first day. The silence after that had weight. Sarah's hand found Emma's face and held it. Emma let her. Jack stepped out of the doorway and left them to it. He stood in the kitchen and drank his coffee cold and listened to the quiet sounds of grief moving through his walls. He started breakfast. It seemed like the only useful thing he could do. Sarah was sitting up when he brought the tray back. She'd pushed herself against the headboard, her color better, and she listened as Emma delivered a detailed accounting of everything that had happened since the attack. And then he gave me the canteen and I drank 3 times and stopped because I didn't know how far we were going. And then I fell asleep on his horse, which I didn't mean to do. You fell asleep about 30 seconds after we started moving, Jack said, setting the tray down. Emma looked mortified. I was resting my eyes. You snored twice. I don't snore. Sarah looked between them, and something in her face came a fraction more alive. "Did he make you beans?" she asked Emma. "Good beans?" "Edible beans," Jack said honestly. "I'm a rancher, not a cook." "He made more this morning," Emma reported. "And cornbread. The cornbread's better than the beans." Sarah ate slowly, deliberately, leaving nothing behind. Jack noticed she tracked every sound from outside, checked the window's position without turning her head. She was running calculations, the same way he'd done when his own world had come apart. He left them alone most of that day. He had work on a ranch that ran on one pair of hands, but he was aware of them in a way he couldn't ignore. Around mid-morning, Emma appeared in the barn doorway, watching him work without a word until he looked up. "She's sleeping again." "Good. Sleep's what she needs." Emma came in and sat on a hay bale. After a while, Jack said, "You want to ask me something?" "How'd you know?" "You've got the same look your mama gets right before she asks something she's not sure she's allowed to ask." "Are we going to have to leave soon?" Jack stopped. "What makes you ask that?" "People don't like extra," Emma said with flat certainty. "Papa used to say most people are only willing to help until it costs them something. Then they find a reason." Something went tight in Jack's chest. "You don't have to leave," he said. "Not until your mama's on her feet and you've got somewhere solid to go. That's a promise." Emma studied him. "You mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean." She picked at the edge of the hay bale. "We don't have anywhere solid to go. Our wagon's gone, our horses, Papa, everything." "One day at a time," Jack said. "That's all." Emma turned that over, then nodded. "Okay, one day at a time." She stayed in the barn for another hour, asking questions about the horses, and gradually getting close enough to touch the nose of the bay mare. She did it quickly, then stepped back and looked at him with wide eyes. "She didn't bite me." "Most of them don't." "She's soft." "They usually are." Emma looked at the horse with careful neutrality that didn't quite manage. "Maybe I'll come back tomorrow to check on the work, make sure you're doing it right." "I'd appreciate the oversight," Jack said. 3 days later, Sarah walked on her own for the first time. She made it to the kitchen table and sat down hard. Jack set coffee in front of her and sat across on his crate. "I need to know about Robert," she said. "I sent word to the sheriff in Laramie the morning after I found you," Jack said. "Told him what Emma told me. They found your wagon. They found Robert. He's been seen to, Sarah. He's not alone." Sarah's hands wrapped around the cup. She didn't speak for a while. "He was a good man," she said finally. "I believe that." "Emma has his eyes. I noticed. Does she seem all right to you? She won't tell me how she was out there." "She wasn't scared. Or if she was, she didn't let it matter." "How do you know?" "Because she held that branch for 2 days and didn't put it down until she decided I was worth 10 minutes of her time." Something shifted in Sarah's face, not quite a smile, but the shape of where one would someday be. "She's in the barn again," she said, changing the subject. "She was afraid of horses. She's working on it. She laughed yesterday, first time since—" Sarah stopped. "I didn't think I'd hear that for a long time." "You don't owe me anything," Jack said, anticipating her. "That's not how the world works. It's how my world works." Sarah looked at him with those careful, measuring eyes. "Tell me about this ranch, how you ended up here alone." So he told her. Pieces of it, the way you offer something fragile to someone you're not yet sure will handle it with care. He told her about the land, his father, the years building it up. He told her about his wife, Margaret. She listened without filling the silences. When Emma came back with hay in her hair and announced the horse's name was obviously Biscuit, Jack looked up and caught Sarah watching him. Something passed between them across the kitchen table. Not romance, not yet, just recognition. It was that evening, while Emma slept and the house had gone quiet, that Jack heard a horse on the road. Wrong gait, wrong pace, moving deliberate and official. He stepped out onto the porch and watched the rider come up the track in the last of the light. Something in the man's bearing, straight-backed, well-dressed, put a cold, quiet feeling in Jack's stomach before a word was spoken. The rider stopped at the fence. He had a leather satchel across his saddle. "I'm looking for a woman named Sarah Wright and her daughter Emma. I have reason to believe they may be here." Jack didn't move. "Who's asking?" The man reached into his coat and produced a card. "My name is Gerald Holt. I'm an attorney. I've traveled from Boston, and I'm afraid I have news that cannot wait." Jack took the card. He looked at it. He looked at the man, and every quiet, careful thing that had been slowly finding its footing over the past week felt in that single moment like it was standing on very uncertain ground. Jack didn't invite Gerald Holt inside. He left him standing on the porch in the cooling evening air while he walked back to the kitchen where Sarah still sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She looked up when he came in, and the question in her eyes didn't need words. "Lawyer from Boston," Jack said. "Name's Holt. He says he's got news that can't wait." Sarah's face went still in a way that was different from her usual guarded stillness. This was the stillness of someone who already knew what the news was, who had been waiting for it to arrive, who had hoped maybe it wouldn't. She set down her cup. "Let him in." Jack went back to the door and opened it wider. Holt stepped inside with the careful courtesy of a man who reads rooms for a living, and he read this one within 3 seconds. He didn't comment on the sparse furniture or the single plate on the drying rack. He sat where Jack pointed, on the crate that had been Emma's seat at breakfast, and set his leather satchel on his knee. "Mrs. Wright," he said, "I'm deeply sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Sarah said. Her voice was flat and level. "Say what you came to say, Mr. Holt." Holt opened the satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers. He laid them on the table with the unhurried precision of a man laying down a hand he's already counted. "Mrs. Eleanor Wright has initiated a petition for legal custody of her granddaughter, Emma Rose Wright. The grounds are that you are currently without fixed residence, without income, without means of providing stable care, and in a medically compromised condition." He paused. "The petition has been filed in the Wyoming Territory Court. A hearing has been scheduled for 3 weeks from Thursday in Laramie." Sarah's hand stayed flat on the table. Her face didn't change. "My daughter is with me," she said. "She is safe and cared for. That petition has no grounds. Mrs. Wright, I understand your position. My client is prepared to demonstrate that Emma would have significantly greater security, education, and material advantage in her care. She is also prepared to demonstrate that your current situation," he glanced briefly around the room, "does not constitute a stable home." "This is my house," Jack said. "They're guests here of their own choosing. That's not instability." Holt turned his attention to Jack with the particular focus of a man who had not previously considered him a factor worth calculating. "And you are?" "Jack Mercer. I own this land." "Your relationship to Mrs. Wright and her daughter?" The question hung in the air. Jack held Holt's gaze. "I'm the man who found them on the flats, unconscious and dying. I'm the man who brought them here. That's enough of a relationship for right now." Holt wrote something down in a small notebook. "I see." He turned back to Sarah. "Mrs. Wright, I want to be direct. My client is not interested in a prolonged legal battle. She is, however, absolutely committed to this petition. She has retained considerable legal representation and has the resources to pursue this as far as necessary. I would strongly encourage you to seek counsel before the hearing." "With what money?" Sarah said. Holt's face remained professionally neutral. Sarah leaned forward. "Tell me something, Mr. Holt. In your professional opinion, not Eleanor Wright's opinion, yours, does a grandmother who has met her granddaughter twice in 5 years and tried to separate her from her father have any genuine claim to that child?" The silence stretched for a beat too long. Sarah nodded slowly. "I thought so." Holt left 20 minutes later. Jack watched from the porch as the horse's hoofbeats faded down the track. When he came back inside, Sarah was still sitting at the table, staring at the papers Holt had left behind. She hadn't touched them. "She'll win," Sarah said. Her voice was even and absolutely flat, without any struggle in it, without any fight. "If it goes to court the way he described, she'll win." "You don't know that." "I know Eleanor Wright." Sarah looked up, and her eyes were dry but wounded. "She has money and lawyers and a house in Boston with 10 rooms, and I am a widow with nothing to my name sitting in a borrowed kitchen in Wyoming. The court will look at this, and they will see exactly what Eleanor wants them to see. Then we make sure they see something different." "You don't have to do this, Jack." She said his name like she wanted him to stop being kind, because kindness was making it harder to hold herself together. "I already did it, the moment I put her on my horse." He crossed to the table and sat down across from her. "Sarah, That child has been in my barn every morning for a week. She named my horse. She sat with you for 2 days without sleeping, without eating, without putting down a broken branch because she decided that was her job and she was going to do it. I'm not standing aside and watching a Boston lawyer take her away from you because Emma Wright has a bigger bank account. I'm not doing that." Sarah looked at him. Something moved through her eyes that was too complicated to name. "What can you do?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. Jack thought about it. Thought about the ranch, the land that was his free and clear. The 8 years he'd spent building something solid out of grief and stubbornness. The hearing in 3 weeks. Every argument Holt had made. "I can give you a home address," he said slowly. "On paper, permanent residence. That takes away one of her arguments." Sarah's eyes didn't leave his face. "And I can testify as the man who found you, who provided care. I know what I saw out there. I know what Emma did. Any judge who listens to that without it meaning something, it's not enough." Sarah's voice was quiet but certain. "A neighbor testifying is not enough against Emma Wright's lawyers. They'll say you're a single man with a questionable interest in a widowed woman. They'll use it against us, not for us." The room was quiet. Somewhere in the back of the house, Emma murmured something in her sleep. Jack heard it, and something in him settled. "Then we give them nothing to use." Sarah went very still. "Marry me." He said it before he could second-guess it, before his mind caught up with his mouth, and the moment the words left him, he knew they were the right ones. Not the way that sounds, legally, on paper, long enough to win this hearing and give you time to get back on your feet. Sarah stared at him. Her face had gone pale. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough." "It's been a week, Jack." "I know that too." "This is insane, you understand that. This is completely insane." "Probably," Jack agreed. "You would do that, for a woman you've known for 7 days and a child who held a branch at you." She held it very convincingly. "Jack," his name came out unsteady, "I cannot ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering. There's a difference." Sarah looked away. She looked at the dark window, at her hands, at the doorway that led to the hall where Emma was sleeping. Her face moved through something bigger than fear and bigger than gratitude, something that didn't have a clean name. "If we do this," she said finally, "it is for Emma, only for Emma. You understand that? That's why I'm suggesting it. And when it's over, when the hearing is done and we've won, we figure that out then." She looked at him again. "One day at a time." Jack heard Emma's own words come back through her mother's mouth. He saw the flicker of recognition cross Sarah's face. She'd caught it too. "All right," she said at last, very quiet and very certain. "All right, Jack." They told Emma in the morning. Jack had thought about it most of the night, how to explain the unexplainable to a child who processed information like a small judge. He still didn't have a perfect answer when Emma sat across the breakfast table and looked between the two of them with those eyes that never missed anything. "Someone is trying to take you away from your mama," Jack said. "We're going to stop them. But to stop them, your mama and I need to be married. So that's what we're going to do." Emma's expression didn't change for a long moment. She ate a bite of cornbread and chewed it thoroughly. "Who's trying to take me?" "Your grandmother, your father's mother." "I've met her 2 times. Emma said flatly. "She smelled like powder and she called me plain." Sarah made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "She won't get me," Emma said. It wasn't a question. "No, she won't." Emma looked at him. "You promise?" Jack thought about the last time he'd made a promise he wasn't certain he could keep. He thought about everything riding on this. The hearing, the judge, the lawyers, Emma Wright's money, a witness in Laramie who had already spoken to Holt. Whether what he had would add up to enough. "I promise." Emma picked up her cornbread. "Okay. Can I go see Biscuit after breakfast?" "Yeah," Jack said. "You can go see Biscuit." The wedding was 3 days later in Laramie, in the office of a justice of the peace who asked no questions beyond what the law required. He witnessed their signatures with the brisk efficiency of a man who had 4 more appointments before noon. Sarah wore her best dress, which was the least damaged of the 2 she owned. Jack wore his good coat, which he hadn't worn in 3 years, and which Emma had told him gravely needed brushing. She stood between them and held both their hands. Nobody had planned it or asked her to, and stood very straight through the entire proceeding. When the justice said the words were done, Emma looked up at Jack. "Are we a family now?" Jack looked at Sarah. She looked back at him, those careful, measuring eyes that had been reading him since the first morning she woke up. "We're something," Jack said. "Good enough," Emma said, and that was that. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon light. Emma fell asleep against Sarah's shoulder before they were out of town, and neither Jack nor Sarah said much on the way. The land opened up around them, wide and golden, and the ranch came into view on the horizon. It looked exactly as it always had, a house that needed paint, a barn with a sagging board, a well that worked, but it felt different now. Jack wasn't sure if it was the marriage or the company or the simple fact that he had something to fight for that wasn't just keeping a piece of ground alive. 2 days after the wedding, a letter arrived from Emma Wright's lawyers. Jack read it on the porch because he didn't want to call Sarah in until he understood what he was looking at. He read it twice. Then he held it in both hands and stared at the horizon for a long time. Emma Wright had found out about the marriage. Her lawyers were characterizing it as a fraudulent arrangement entered into specifically to manipulate the court's judgment. They were requesting that the judge disqualify the marriage as evidence of stability, and they had found a witness. Someone in Laramie who had spoken to Gerald Holt, who had confirmed that Jack Mercer had been living alone on this ranch for 8 years. Someone who was prepared to testify that the marriage was, in their opinion, a legal convenience and nothing more. The hearing was now less than 2 weeks away. Jack heard Emma's laugh carry from the barn, bright and sudden. Then Sarah's voice, lower and warm, responding to whatever had caused it. He looked down at the letter in his hands. Emma Wright had money and lawyers and a witness, and she was not playing at this. She had come to win. And Jack Mercer stood on his own porch holding a piece of paper that told him, clearly and precisely and without sentiment, that what he had might not be enough. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He didn't tell Sarah that night. He told himself it was because Emma was at the table and the timing was wrong, and that was true enough to lean on for a few hours. But when Emma went to bed, and the kitchen went quiet, and Sarah looked at him across the table with those eyes that never missed much, he pulled the letter out and set it flat between them without a word. She read it once. She set it down. She picked it up and read it again. "A witness," she said. "Someone Holt found in town. I don't know who yet. Someone who'll say the marriage is fake." Sarah set the letter down carefully, like she was trying not to treat it the way she wanted to treat it. "Can they actually disqualify it? The marriage? I don't know. I need to talk to someone who does." "We don't have a lawyer, Jack." "I know that." "Emma Wright has 3. "I know that too." Sarah pressed both hands flat on the table, the way she did when she was thinking hard and needed to feel something solid. "Then what do we do?" "Tomorrow I ride into Laramie. I find out who Holt talked to. I find someone who can tell us where we stand legally." He met her eyes. "And we don't panic. Not yet." "I'm not panicking. I'm calculating." "What's the difference?" "Panic doesn't have a plan at the end of it." She looked at the letter again. "This witness. If Eleanor's lawyers are calling the marriage fraudulent, they need to prove intent. They need to prove we didn't mean it. We've known each other 10 days. People have married faster. Not usually a rancher and a widow whose husband was buried 2 weeks prior." Jack said it flat because it needed to be said flat, without softening. A judge looking at this from Emma Wright's angle sees exactly what she wants him to see. The lamp between them pushed their shadows long against the walls. Outside, the Wyoming night had gone dark and silent. The only sound in the house was the occasional shift of Emma turning over in her sleep. "Then we give him something else to look at," Sarah said. "Something real." She looked at him directly. "You've had Emma in that barn every morning for a week. You fixed the chair leg she broke the day before yesterday without saying a word about it. You moved her branch." Jack looked up. "I saw you," Sarah said quietly. "You moved it from the floor beside the bed to the wall beside the door. So she could see it, but it wasn't in the way. You didn't do that for a legal strategy. You did it because you were paying attention to a frightened child." Something in Jack's chest was doing something uncomfortable. That's what we show the judge, Sarah said, not paperwork. What's actually true? What's actually true is we've known each other 10 days. What's actually true, Sarah said, is that you found a child with a broken branch and 2 days of grief on her back, and you didn't right away. Her voice was steady and precise, completely without sentimentality. You need to stop undervaluing that. Jack looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Margaret, who had also had the ability to look at him and see past whatever he was showing on the surface. He thought about how long it had been since anyone had done that. He picked up the letter and folded it and put it away. "I'll write at first light." He was gone before Emma woke up. He left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Back before dark," and a pot of oats on the stove, the best he could do for breakfast. The ride into Laramie gave him time to think, and thinking gave him a list, and the list kept getting longer the longer he worked through it. By the time he reached town, he had worked himself into a focused and completely unproductive fury at Gerald Holt and Eleanor Wright, and the entire legal apparatus that allowed a woman who had called her own granddaughter plain to walk into a Wyoming courtroom and claim that child as property. He cooled down before he got off his horse. Anger was a fire that burned the man holding it. He needed his head clear. The lawyer's name was Thomas Briggs. He worked out of a narrow office above the feed store, and he had the unhurried, slightly dusty manner of a man who had handled enough frontier disputes to be unimpressed by most things. Jack had met him twice before, once over a boundary disagreement that resolved itself, once over his father's will. Briggs had been efficient and honest both times. That was enough. Briggs read Eleanor Wright's letter without changing expression. He read it again. He set it down. "They're not wrong, technically. Tell me something I don't know. They can argue the marriage was entered into with intent to deceive the court. That's a meaningful argument. A judge sympathetic to Mrs. Wright Sr. could give it real weight." Briggs laced his fingers on the desk. "However, intent to deceive requires demonstrating the marriage has no genuine basis. That's harder to prove than it sounds. Courts are generally reluctant to rule a legal marriage fraudulent without significant evidence. Their witness, one witness testifying that the marriage looks convenient, is not the same as evidence of fraud, especially if you can produce counter-testimony." Briggs looked at him steadily. "Is there counter-testimony? I've got a 5-year-old who can testify to what kind of man I am, though I doubt that helps." "It might help more than you think," Briggs said. "Not the child testifying, but affidavits, character witnesses, people who know you, who can speak to your reputation, your stability, your capacity." He leaned back. "The judge in this case is Samuel Hartley. He's been on the bench here 12 years. He is not interested in Boston money, and he is not interested in being told what the right answer is before he's heard the question. What he is interested in is what's genuinely best for that child. If you can give him a clear, honest picture of what life at your ranch looks like for Emma Wright, not a legal argument, an actual picture, you have a reasonable chance. What about the inheritance? If Eleanor's claim is about controlling the money, that's the other piece." Briggs' voice went careful. "Emma Wright is heir to a significant trust from the Wright family estate. Eleanor Wright is currently the trustee. If the court awards her custody, she retains that control indefinitely. If your wife retains custody, the trust passes to Emma on her 21st birthday, outside Eleanor's control." Jack was silent. "So this was never about the child." "I can't speak to Mrs. Wright Sr.'s motivations," Briggs said, "but the financial structure makes her position considerably clearer." Jack rode back with two things: a better understanding of the ground he was standing on, and a cold, quiet anger that had nowhere useful to go. He told Sarah everything at the kitchen table that evening, with Emma in the barn saying goodnight to Biscuit, giving them exactly the window they needed. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat still for a moment. "It was always about the money," she said. "Looks that way. Robert knew that. That's why he never let Emma near her." Her voice went flat and hard. "That woman stood at her own son's wedding and told me I was nobody, that I was getting above myself. And Robert looked at her and said, 'Then we'll be nobody together, Mother.' And we left. He never looked back. Not once." Jack let her have the moment. Character witnesses, she said, pulling herself back. Who do you have? Ranchers I've traded with, a couple of men in town. The pastor in Laramie. I've helped with winter supply runs for his congregation 3 years running. He paused. Who do you have? Sarah's expression shifted. No one. I don't know anyone in Wyoming. I've been here a week and a half. Then we use mine. There's also Bill Crane, the sheriff. He was the one I sent word to about Robert. He's an honest man and he doesn't owe Emma Wright anything. A sheriff testifying to your character is good, very good, she thought. What about the judge? Does he know you? By name, maybe. By reputation. I haven't been in court since the boundary issue 4 years back. Did you behave yourself? Yes, ma'am. Something flashed in Sarah's eyes that was almost a smile. The next 10 days moved with the compressed, breathless quality of time under pressure. Every hour purposeful, every conversation carrying more weight than it should have. Jack wrote out and gathered character witnesses. Sarah organized every piece of documentation they had. The land deed, his father's will, the ranch's income records, Emma's birth certificate, a letter from the doctor who had treated Sarah's injuries. She laid it all out on the kitchen table with the focused, systematic efficiency of a woman who had decided that emotion was a resource to be spent carefully. You're organized, Jack said. I used to keep the accounts for Robert's trade business, Sarah said without looking up. I know what paperwork can do in the right hands. Emma, for her part, had been told as much as a 5-year-old needed to know, that some people were trying to take her away, and Jack and Sarah were making sure they didn't. She asked 3 precise questions. Who is the judge? What does the judge decide? Can I tell him about Biscuit? Then she went back to the barn, apparently satisfied that the situation was being managed. She did wake Jack once in the middle of the night, appearing in his doorway in her nightgown with bare feet and the careful expression of a child who had been thinking about something for several hours. What if the judge says she wins? Jack sat up. He won't. But what if? He looked at her in the dark. Then we go back to court, and we go back again after that, and we keep going back until someone listens. Emma turned that over. That could take a long time. Yeah, it could. Would you still do it, even if it took a long time? Emma, I promised. She stood there for another moment. Then she crossed the room and put both arms around him, brief and tight, the way a child hugs when she doesn't have words for what she means. Then she stepped back and walked to her room with her chin level. Jack sat in the dark for a long time after that. The morning before the hearing, Sarah found him in the barn. He was forking hay into Biscuit's stall, and he heard her footsteps on the packed earth behind him. He turned. Something in her face told him this was not a conversation about paperwork. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. I told you I was the cautious one, the one who thinks before she acts. I have been thinking very carefully for the past 11 days about what you did, what you are doing. She pressed her lips together. I think you have been doing this from a place of genuine decency, and I have been so focused on the practical reality that I haven't. She stopped. I don't know what this is, Jack, between us. I don't know what it's going to be or what it's allowed to be or whether there's any. I don't know any of that. But I want you to know that I see you, what you actually are, not what you're pretending to be for a court or for Emma or for anyone. Her voice went careful. You are a good man, Jack Mercer. That is not a small thing to me. It is not a small thing at all. Jack stood very still. I just wanted to say it, Sarah said. Before tomorrow. In case... She left it unfinished. In case it goes wrong, he said. In case it goes wrong. He looked at her across the dim space of the barn. He thought about 10 days and broken branches and cornbread and a child sleeping in a chair and a letter from a Boston lawyer and everything that had accumulated between the moment he heard a scream on the Wyoming flats and this exact second. It won't go wrong, he said. You don't know that. No, he said, but I know we've done everything right, and sometimes that's enough. Sarah held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded once, that single certain nod he'd come to recognize as her version of deciding something, and turned toward the house. Emma's already dressed, she said over her shoulder. She's been up since before dawn. She asked me if she could bring Biscuit to Laramie. What did you tell her? I told her horses don't testify. What did she say? She said Biscuit has a very persuasive face. Sarah paused at the barn door. She's not wrong. Despite everything, Jack laughed. He was still holding on to that sound, that strange lightness, when they rode into Laramie the next morning under a high Wyoming sky. Emma sat up straight between them like she was riding into battle and had personally decided they were going to win. The courthouse was a two-story building on the main street that Jack had passed 100 times without much reason to look at closely. Today, he looked at it closely. He looked at Eleanor Wright's carriage parked outside it, black and well-kept and expensive, the kind of carriage that announces before you've said a word that its owner considers the outcome already settled. And beside the carriage stood Eleanor Wright herself. She was tall, in her 60s, dressed in Boston black with the rigid posture of someone who had spent a lifetime using their height as an argument. Her eyes found them the moment they dismounted and traveled from Jack to Sarah to Emma. When they reached Emma, they did something that Jack watched very carefully. They went calculating. Not warm, not tender, not the eyes of a grandmother seeing her grandchild, the eyes of someone assessing an asset. Emma looked back at her with absolute stillness. Eleanor Wright took 3 steps forward. "Emma," she said. Her voice was cultured and cold. "You've grown." Emma's hand found Jack's without looking for it. Her fingers wrapped around 2 of his. She didn't say a word. Eleanor's eyes dropped to that small hand locked in Jack's, and something moved in her expression. Not softened, harder, like she had just recalibrated the level of effort this would require. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, moving her gaze to Sarah, "I hope you understand that this is not personal." "My husband is dead," Sarah said. "My daughter is standing in front of a courthouse at 6 years old. Everything about this is personal, Mrs. Wright." Eleanor's chin lifted. "The court will determine what's best for Emma. That's all I've ever wanted." "Then we agree on something," Sarah said. "That's all we want, too." The doors of the courthouse opened, and Jack Mercer walked in with his wife on one side and his daughter's hand in his, carrying nothing but 11 days of truth and a promise he intended to keep. He did not look back at Eleanor Wright's carriage, or her lawyers, or her cold, calculating face. He looked straight ahead, toward the bench where Judge Samuel Hartley sat waiting, with 12 years of Wyoming justice behind his eyes, and Jack prayed that would be enough. Judge Samuel Hartley sat behind the bench with the unhurried stillness of a man who had watched enough desperate people walk through those doors that he no longer needed to announce his authority. It was simply there, in the way he looked over his spectacles, the way he waited for the room to settle before he spoke. The courtroom was half full. A handful of townsfolk who had heard something worth watching was happening. A clerk at a side table with a ledger, a bailiff standing near the door with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Jack and Sarah sat at the table on the right. Thomas Briggs sat beside them with one folder open in front of him, his pen resting on the page, his expression the particular blankness of a man who had been in enough courtrooms to know that the first 10 minutes told you more than the next 10 hours. Emma sat in a chair against the wall to the side, where Briggs had told her she needed to be quiet and still. She had looked at him with the flat expression she reserved for instructions she found unnecessary and said, "I know how to be quiet." She folded her hands in her lap and became the stillest person in the room. Eleanor Wright sat at the table on the left, flanked by 3 lawyers in Eastern suits. Her back was straight, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her face composed into an expression of patient endurance, as if this entire proceeding were an inconvenience she was tolerating rather than an event she had initiated. The lead lawyer, Caldwell, stood when Hartley nodded at him. He was tall and lean, with the kind of voice that had been trained to fill rooms, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been the underdog in a courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, "we are here today on a petition for custody of Emma Rose Wright, minor child of Robert Wright, deceased, and Sarah Wright, now Sarah Mercer." He said, "Now Sarah Mercer," with a pause that gave the words more weight than they should have carried. The petitioner, Mrs. Eleanor Wright, is the child's paternal grandmother. She seeks custody on the grounds that the child's mother cannot provide a stable home, cannot provide for the child's material needs, and is currently residing in a situation that raises serious questions about the stability and legitimacy of her living arrangement. Caldwell turned slightly, gesturing toward Jack and Sarah's table without looking at them. Mrs. Mercer married a man she had known for approximately 10 days. 10 days, Your Honor. A man who had been living alone on a remote ranch for 8 years prior. A man who, by his own admission, had no prior relationship with Mrs. Mercer or her daughter. The timing of this marriage, coming precisely when Mrs. Mercer faced the loss of her daughter to a more capable guardian, raises unavoidable questions about its purpose. He paused, letting that land. We intend to show that this marriage was entered into not as a genuine union, but as a strategic measure designed to create the appearance of stability where none exists. We intend to show that the child's best interests lie with her grandmother, who has the resources, the home, and the long-term stability to provide for Emma Wright's future. He sat down. Hartley looked at Briggs. Counselor. Briggs rose slowly, the way a man rises when he has no need to rush. He adjusted his coat and looked at the judge with the easy familiarity of someone who had stood before this bench before. Your Honor, my clients do not dispute that Mrs. Eleanor Wright has financial resources. They do not dispute that the marriage is recent. What they dispute is the characterization of that marriage as fraudulent, and they dispute the claim that financial resources alone determine what is best for a child. He turned and looked at Emma for just a moment, then back at the judge. The child's mother survived an attack that killed her husband. She lay unconscious in the Wyoming sun for 2 days while her 5-year-old daughter stood guard over her with a broken branch, refusing to leave, refusing to give up. That is the kind of love that cannot be measured in square footage or school fees. That is what we are here to show. He sat down. Hartley nodded once. Call your first witness. Eleanor's case unfolded with the precision of a machine built for efficiency. Caldwell called Dale Purcell first. Purcell walked to the stand with the reluctant shuffle of a man who had not expected to be part of anything like this when he opened his store that morning. He was sworn in, and Caldwell walked him through his testimony with practiced ease. Yes, he had known Jack Mercer for 8 years. Yes, Jack had always been a solitary man, kept to himself, rarely came to town. Yes, it had been a surprise to learn that Jack had married a woman no one in Laramie had ever seen before. No, he had never seen Jack with a woman or a child prior to the past few weeks. In your opinion, Mr. Purcell, Caldwell said, does Mr. Mercer's sudden marriage strike you as consistent with his character as you have observed it over 8 years? Purcell shifted in his chair. I don't know that I'd say it's consistent, he said slowly, but I also don't know that I'd say a man can change. But you observed nothing in 8 years to suggest Mr. Mercer was looking for a family or intending to marry. No, sir. He seemed content enough alone. Caldwell thanked him and sat down. Briggs rose for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand with the loose-limbed gait of a man who had nothing to prove. Mr. Purcell, in the 8 years you've known Jack Mercer, has he ever given you cause to doubt his honesty? No. Has he ever failed to honor a debt or a promise? No. Has he ever, in your presence, treated a woman or a child with anything other than respect? Purcell hesitated. Well, I can't say I've ever seen him with a woman or a child before this. That's not what I asked, Briggs said mildly. I asked if you had ever seen him treat one poorly. No, I haven't. So your testimony is essentially that a man you have found consistently honest and decent for 8 years did something that seemed unusual to you. That is the sum of it? Purcell frowned. I suppose so. Thank you, Mr. Purcell. That'll be all. Caldwell called 2 more witnesses, both associates of Eleanor Wright, both testifying from a distance. One was a banker in Boston who spoke to Eleanor's financial stability. The other was a neighbor of Eleanor's who described her home, her staff, her standing in the community. Both looked at Emma exactly once, quickly, the way you glance at an object you're discussing rather than a person you're concerned about. Emma noticed. Jack saw her notice. Her chin went up by 1 degree. Then it was Briggs's turn. He called Sheriff Bill Crane. The big man took the stand with the unhurried authority of someone who had spent his life reading situations and people, and who had found that most things were simpler than they looked. He was sworn in. Briggs asked him about his knowledge of Jack Mercer. Crane leaned back in the chair. I've known Jack Mercer for about 6 years, on and off. Rode with him a few times when I needed a hand tracking stolen stock. He's steady, doesn't panic, doesn't lie. If he tells you something, you can take it to the bank. In your professional judgment, Sheriff, is Mr. Mercer the kind of man a child would be safe with? Crane looked at Jack. There is no child in Wyoming I would feel more confidently leaving in his care. Caldwell tried to rattle Crane on cross-examination. Sheriff, you've known Mr. Mercer for 6 years. Have you ever seen him interact with a child before this situation? No. So you have no direct observation of his ability to care for a child. I have direct observation of his character, Crane said, and I know that character is the same whether there's a child in the room or not. A man who is honest and steady when no one is watching is honest and steady when everyone is watching. That's what I see in Jack Mercer. Caldwell moved on. Briggs called 2 ranchers next, both men who had traded with Jack, shared fence lines with him, and sat through long winter evenings in his kitchen. They spoke plainly, without flourish. Jack Mercer's word was good, his hand was steady, his land was his own. One of them, an older man named Hargrove, added unprompted, "If Jack Mercer says he's married to that woman, then he's married. He ain't the type to do something for show. He don't have the patience for it." Caldwell objected. Hartley sustained it. But the words had been said, and they hung in the air anyway. Then Briggs called the pastor. Reverend Wells was a thin man with a gentle voice and the kind of eyes that had seen too much suffering to be surprised by it. He testified that Jack Mercer had delivered winter supplies to his congregation for 3 consecutive years, without being asked and without seeking recognition. He came in December of the first year with a wagon of firewood and flour, the pastor said. I asked him what had prompted it. He said he had more than he needed, and it seemed wasteful not to share. That was all. He didn't want a sermon about it. He didn't want his name read from the pulpit. He just did it. Is that the act of a man who lacks a genuine sense of commitment to others? Briggs asked. Caldwell objected. Hartley overruled. Answer the question. No, the pastor said. That is the act of a man who understands that commitment does not always need to be announced. Then Briggs called Sarah. She walked to the stand with the straight-backed composure of a woman who had decided exactly what she was going to say and had made peace with the cost of saying it. She sat down. She looked at Hartley, nodded at Caldwell, and then looked at Jack, just briefly, just enough. Briggs asked her to describe how she met Jack Mercer. She told it plain and without decoration. The attack, Robert's death. Emma alone in the heat with a broken branch. Jack appearing on the ridge. She told it the way it happened, without softening the desperate reality of what their situation had been, without making it sound like anything other than what it was. 2 strangers brought together by the worst possible circumstances. When Mr. Mercer offered to help you, Briggs said, were you suspicious of his intentions? Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. I was a woman alone with a child and a dying body in Wyoming. I was suspicious of everything. What changed your mind? Sarah was quiet for a moment. He moved a branch. The courtroom was silent. My daughter had been carrying a broken branch for 2 days, Sarah said. She'd used it to guard me while I was unconscious. When we got to the ranch, she left it on the floor beside my bed because she didn't want to be far from it. And Jack moved it, without saying anything, without pointing it out, to the wall beside the door, where she could see it and reach it, but where it wasn't in the way. He didn't do that because a lawyer told him to. He did it because he was paying attention to a frightened child. Her voice held steady. That's when I knew what kind of man I was dealing with. Caldwell's cross-examination was precise and aggressive. He focused on the timeline. 10 days, the speed of the marriage, the legal advantage it created. He was building toward the word fraudulent, and everyone in the room could hear him building. Mrs. Mercer, he said, finally arriving at it, isn't it true that you married Mr. Mercer specifically to strengthen your position in this courtroom? Sarah looked at him. It's true that the marriage created a stronger legal position, she said. It's also true that Jack Mercer asked me to marry him because he didn't want to stand aside and watch my daughter be taken from me by a woman who called her plain the one time they met. You're asking me if the marriage was convenient. Yes, it was convenient. It was also the act of a man willing to stake his own name and land and life on two strangers he'd known 10 days. I'll let the court decide what to call that. Caldwell moved on. He was not finished. Mrs. Mercer, if the judge were to award you full custody today, and if you were subsequently to separate from Mr. Mercer, your daughter's inheritance would remain entirely outside my client's control, correct? Correct. So you would stand to benefit financially from today's outcome, regardless of the state of your marriage. My daughter would benefit, Sarah said. There's a difference. Is there? Caldwell said. Because from where I stand, Mrs. Mercer, it appears that everyone at that table benefits from this arrangement, except perhaps Mr. Mercer himself, which raises the question of what exactly he was offered in return. The insinuation hit the room like a slap. Jack's hands went flat and hard on the table. He kept his face absolutely still, the concentrated effort of a man who had decided that reacting was exactly what this lawyer wanted. Sarah's eyes went briefly to Jack's. 1 second, a look that was part apology, part steadiness, part something else entirely. Nothing, she said clearly. He was offered nothing, because he didn't ask for anything. Caldwell let the silence work for him, then sat down. Hartley looked at his clock. We will recess for 1 hour. During the recess, Jack stood outside the courthouse with his back to the wall and his arms crossed. Briggs stood beside him, speaking in a low, careful voice about how the afternoon would go. Jack heard most of it and retained some of it. The rest of his attention was on Emma, who was sitting on the courthouse steps with her hands folded and her chin up, watching the street with the alert stillness of a small soldier waiting for orders. Sarah came and sat beside her. She put an arm around her daughter, and Emma leaned in without a word. They sat like that, Sarah watching the street and Emma watching something further off, neither of them speaking. Jack watched them. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the empty house, the single plate, the coat on the hook. He thought about the moment on the ridge when he had looked down and seen Emma Wright with her broken branch and made a decision that wasn't really a decision at all, just the only thing he could do. He thought about the possibility that it wasn't going to be enough. Emma looked up and found him standing there. She stood up and walked over to him. "Are you scared?" she asked. "A little," he said. "You?" "A little," she said. "But I was scared for 2 days in the dirt, and I didn't put the branch down." She held his gaze. "So?" Jack looked at her. "So," he said. She nodded once and went back to the steps. When the afternoon session opened, Caldwell made a formal motion to have the marriage set aside as evidence on the grounds of its fraudulent nature. Hartley denied it in 2 sentences. The denial sent a current through the room that Caldwell felt and did not show. Then Hartley did something no one expected. He looked over at Emma. "Young lady," he said, "will you come up here, please?" Caldwell was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, the child has not been submitted as a witness, and she is under the age of—" "I'm not treating her as a witness, Counselor," Hartley said with the calm of a man who had been interrupted by lawyers for 12 years and had developed a precise tolerance for it. "I would like to speak with her. Sit down." Caldwell sat down. Eleanor Wright's composure cracked by 1 visible degree. Emma walked to the front of the courtroom with her hands at her sides and her chin level. She stood before the judge's bench and looked up at him without flinching. Hartley looked down at her over his spectacles. "What's your name?" "Emma Rose Wright, almost 6. "Almost 6?" he repeated. "And do you know why you're here today?" "Yes, sir. My grandmother wants to take me away from my mama. Jack and Mama are trying to stop her." "And what do you want?" Emma didn't hesitate. "I want to stay with my mama." A pause. "And Jack." "Why Jack?" Hartley said. Emma thought about this for a serious moment. "Because he moved my branch," she said. "And he didn't tell me he did it. He just did it." She paused. "And because he kept his hand steady when he picked up Mama so he wouldn't hurt her side. And because when I asked him if he was going to make us leave, he said no. And he didn't say it like a grown-up says things to make you stop asking. He said it like it was just true." She looked at the judge directly. "I'm pretty good at knowing when things are just true." Hartley studied her for a long moment. "You may sit down, Emma." Emma turned and walked back to her chair. She did not look at Eleanor Wright. She did not look at Caldwell. She sat down, folded her hands, and became still again. Caldwell made one more attempt. He stood and talked about resources and futures and the child's best interests and Boston schools. Every word of it was competent. None of it landed the way Emma Wright's 7 words had landed. Everyone in the room felt the difference. Then Caldwell did something Jack hadn't anticipated. He looked at Jack directly. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "if this court awards custody to Mrs. Mercer today, and if your marriage subsequently dissolves, would you be willing to sign over your land as a financial guarantee of Emma's security to prove that your commitment here is genuine and not strategic?" The room went very still. It was a trap with teeth. Say yes, and he was signing away the land his father built. Say no, and he was handing Caldwell exactly the doubt he needed. Jack stood up. He didn't look at Briggs. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked at Caldwell, and then he looked at Judge Hartley. Yes. The word landed in the silence like a stone in still water. "Without condition," Jack said. "If that's what the court needs to see, yes." Caldwell had not expected that. The small hesitation in his face told the whole room so. Sarah's hand found Jack's arm under the table and held it and did not let go. Hartley looked at Jack for a long moment. Then he looked at Caldwell. Then he looked at his papers. "That won't be necessary," he said. "I have heard enough. I will deliberate before rendering my decision. This court is in recess for 40 minutes. He rose. The bailiff called for all to rise. And then the room emptied, slowly, like a breath being let out. They waited in the hallway. Jack stood with his back to the wall. Sarah sat on a bench, Emma in her lap, her arms wrapped around her daughter. Briggs read his folder for what was probably the 8th time. The hallway had the particular suspended quality of time that only exists in courthouses while someone else decides your life. Eleanor Wright waited on the other side of the hall with her lawyers around her. She did not look at Sarah or Jack, but twice Jack caught her looking at Emma. Both times her expression was the same thing. Not love, not grief, not even anger, just calculation. The inventory of something she had expected to acquire and might not. The minutes passed. Emma fell asleep against Sarah's shoulder, her breathing slow and even, her small hand still wrapped around a fold of her mother's dress. Jack watched her. He thought about the branch, still leaning against the wall beside the door at home. He thought about the way she had stood in the barn that first morning, asking questions about horses she was terrified of, determined not to stay terrified. He thought about the promise he had made to her in the dark of his bedroom. And he made a second one, silently, to himself. When the bailiff opened the doors, Emma woke instantly, the way she always did, and slid off Sarah's lap. She took both their hands, one in each of hers, and walked with them back into the courtroom. The weight of those small fingers wrapped around his own felt like the heaviest and lightest thing Jack had ever carried. Hartley entered. The room stood. He sat. They sat. He looked at his papers. He looked up. "I have considered the petition brought by Mrs. Eleanor Wright for custody of Emma Rose Wright. I have considered the counter-petition of Sarah Mercer, the child's mother." He paused. "The law in this territory is clear that a mother's right to her child is not a minor consideration to be set aside by financial advantage alone. The petitioner has presented this court with an impressive accounting of material resources. She has not presented this court with a compelling reason to believe those resources would substitute for what this child already has." He looked up. "Emma Wright has a mother who survived an attack that killed her husband and lay unconscious in Wyoming heat for days, while her daughter, not yet 6 years old, stood guard over her with a broken branch and refused to leave. I would challenge anyone in this room to tell me that child doesn't know what love is and what it's worth." Eleanor Wright's face had gone entirely still. "The petition is denied," Hartley said. "Custody remains with the child's mother. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down. The sound of it hung in the air, and the room stayed held in the breath before everything changed. And then Emma made a sound, not a cry, not a cheer, just a sound that was the release of everything a nearly 6-year-old had been holding in her body for 3 weeks. She turned and put her face against Sarah's shoulder. Sarah wrapped both arms around her and closed her eyes and held on. Jack stood beside them with his hand on Emma's back, feeling the enormous, quiet fact of it move through him. Eleanor Wright left without speaking. Her lawyers gathered their papers. The carriage outside moved away down the Laramie Street, and the sound of it faded, and it was over. Briggs shook Jack's hand and said something about paperwork. Crane nodded once on his way out, the nod of a man saying, "Well done," without needing to spend words on it. They were the last ones out. Emma held both their hands down the courthouse steps into the afternoon light. When they reached the bottom, she looked up at Jack with wet eyes that she was clearly annoyed at herself for having. "I knew it," she said fiercely. "I knew the whole time." "Did you?" Jack said. "I told Biscuit this morning we were going to win." "What did Biscuit say?" Emma considered this. "Horses know things." Sarah laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that surprised itself. Jack heard it and felt something in his chest that he recognized now, a fire that had already caught, that did not need to be cautious anymore. They rode home. Emma fell asleep against Sarah's shoulder before they were out of town, the same way she had fallen asleep on Jack's horse the first day. Going from fierce alertness to complete unconsciousness with the decisive efficiency of a child who had finished everything that needed doing. Jack and Sarah rode side by side in the late afternoon and did not speak for a while. The land opened up around them, flat and golden and enormous. The ranch came into view on the horizon, solid and waiting. "Jack," Sarah said. "Yeah? I don't think I want this to be just on paper." She said it the way she said everything important, flat and direct and without flinching. "When you're ready, whenever that is. I don't want this to be just on paper." Jack looked at the road ahead. He looked at the ranch on the horizon. He looked at Emma sleeping and Sarah steady beside him. "It hasn't been just on paper," he said, "since she named my horse." He had spent 8 years holding grief like a door shut against the cold. He noticed its absence now, noticed the way he moved through his own life without the familiar heaviness of all that empty space pressing in. Sarah put her hand in his, and he held it. They rode home together, into the last light of the day, and the house ahead of them was no longer just a house. It was something else now. Something that had started with a broken branch and an impossible promise, and had become, against all odds, exactly what it was supposed to be. The first week after the hearing passed in a kind of quiet wonder. Jack had expected the relief to fade quickly, the way relief always did, replaced by the next thing that needed attention, the next fence that needed mending, the next morning that needed to be met. But the relief did not fade. It settled into the bones of the house the way warmth settled into a room after a fire had been burning long enough that the walls themselves forgot what cold felt like. Emma started each day in the barn. It had become as fixed a routine as sunrise. She would appear at the kitchen door while Jack was still working through his first cup of coffee, already dressed, already determined, and she would announce, "Biscuit needs me," as if she were a professional with a schedule to keep. She did not ask permission. She simply informed them, and then she walked out to the barn with the same purposeful stride she had used to walk into that courtroom. And she did not return until the horse had been thoroughly talked to, brushed, and informed of the day's events. Sarah watched this from the kitchen window the third morning in a row. Her coffee cup was warm in her hands, and the sunlight was coming through the glass in that particular Wyoming way, golden and forgiving, and she said, without turning around, "She's not scared of horses anymore." "She decided not to be," Jack said from the table. "That's how she works. She decides something, and then she is that thing." Sarah turned and looked at him. There was something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Or maybe he had seen it and hadn't known what to call it. "That's how you work, too," she said. Jack considered this. He had never thought of himself as someone who decided things and then became them. He had always thought of himself as someone who simply did what needed doing, without much reflection on what it said about him. But he looked at the way Emma had walked into that barn on the first morning, terrified and determined, and he recognized something in it that felt familiar. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe she learned it from watching you." Sarah said nothing to that. She turned back to the window, and the quiet that settled between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that two people share when they have already said the important things and are learning to be comfortable in the space between them. The house started to change. It was not a dramatic transformation. The coat that had hung by the door for so long that it seemed like part of the wall was moved to a hook in the bedroom. A second cup appeared on the drying rack. Then a third, smaller, with a chip on the rim that Emma had claimed as her own because she said it made it easier to hold. Sarah found an old flour sack in the pantry and turned it into curtains for the kitchen window. They were not fancy curtains. They were white flour sack with a simple hem, and they let the light through in a way that softened the whole room. Jack came in from the barn one evening and stopped in the doorway. The kitchen looked different. It took him a moment to realize it was the curtains. He stood there longer than he needed to, and Sarah looked up from the stove and followed his gaze. "Too much?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's just—" He stopped. "It's been a long time since anyone put curtains up in here." Sarah waited. "Margaret never liked the morning light coming in too strong," he said. "She put up curtains the first week we were married. Blue ones. They stayed up until after she passed." He had not said Margaret's name out loud in a long time. It felt strange on his tongue, but not painful. Just heavy, in the way that a thing carried for many years becomes heavy without you noticing until you set it down. "I'm sorry," Sarah said. "I didn't mean to." "Don't be sorry," Jack said. "It's good. It's a good change." Sarah looked at the curtains, then back at him. "You think Margaret would have minded?" Jack thought about it. "No," he said. "She would have liked them. She would have liked you." He did not know why he said that. It was just true. Sarah held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she turned back to the stove, and the quiet between them was different now, deeper, like something had been laid down between them that had not been there before. They fell into a rhythm. It was not the rhythm Jack had known for 8 years, the solitary march from dawn to dark with only the sound of his own thoughts for company. It was something else entirely. Sarah rose early and had coffee ready before he came in from the first rounds. She did not ask him where he was going or when he would be back. She simply had the coffee there, and when he came through the door, she set a cup in front of him without a word. Emma had her own tasks. She had decided, without consulting anyone, that her job was to keep the wood box by the stove filled. This was not a job she had been assigned. She had simply noticed one day that the wood box was low, and she had filled it, and she had been filling it ever since. She was not large enough to carry more than 2 pieces at a time, but she made enough trips that the box stayed full. Jack noticed. He did not say anything about it. He simply started leaving smaller pieces of split wood stacked near the back door where she could reach them. They ate dinner together every evening. The first few nights, the meals were quiet, the way meals are quiet when people are still learning how to be around each other. But by the end of the first week, Emma had started filling the silence with stories about Biscuit, about what the horse had said to her that day, about the conversations they had had, about the important matters of equine opinion that Jack and Sarah needed to be aware of. "Biscuit thinks the hay in the north paddock is better than the hay in the barn," Emma announced one evening. "She told me this morning." "Did she?" Jack said. "She said it's sweeter. I tried some and she's right." "You ate the horse's hay?" Sarah said. "Just a little bit, to confirm her report." Jack looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Jack. And then, without either of them meaning to, they both laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was the kind of laugh that came from somewhere deep and unexpected, the kind that surprised itself. Emma looked between them with an expression of dignified offense. "It's important to verify information," she said. "That's what Papa used to say." The laughter stopped, but not in a bad way, in the way that something is remembered and honored by the silence that follows it. Sarah reached across the table and touched Emma's hand. "That's a very good habit," she said. "Your Papa was right." Emma nodded. Then she picked up her cornbread and took a bite. "Biscuit also says the creek on the east side needs to be checked. She says it sounds like it's running low." "I'll check it tomorrow," Jack said. "Good," Emma said. "I'll come with you, to translate." The second week brought something Jack had not anticipated. He was in the barn, mending a harness that had cracked in the dry air, when he heard footsteps that were too heavy to be Emma's. He looked up. Sarah stood in the doorway, holding a piece of paper in her hand. Her face was unreadable, but the way she was holding the paper told him everything. "What is it?" he said. She crossed the barn and handed it to him. It was a letter from Thomas Briggs, forwarded from his office in Laramie. Briggs had written that Eleanor Wright had filed an appeal. She was challenging Judge Hartley's decision on the grounds that the marriage had not been properly scrutinized and that new evidence had come to light. The appeal would be heard in Cheyenne, at the territorial level, in 6 weeks. Jack read it twice. Then he set the letter down on the workbench and looked at Sarah. "New evidence," he said. "What new evidence?" "Briggs doesn't say. He says he'll ride out tomorrow to discuss it." Sarah crossed her arms. She was standing in the doorway of his barn, in the light that was starting to go golden with afternoon, and she was holding herself together with the same fierce composure she had shown in that courtroom. But Jack had been watching her long enough now to see the cracks in it, the places where she was holding on by will alone. "She won't stop," Sarah said. "She will keep coming until she runs out of money or until she gets what she wants. And she has a lot of money." "We knew this was a possibility," Jack said. "I know. We won once. We can win again." "I know." She looked at him. "But it's different now, Jack. The first time it was about the marriage being real. We had the truth on our side, and we proved it. But if Eleanor is appealing, she's going to find something else. She's going to find a way to make us look like we're not fit. We are fit. I know we are." Her voice cracked, just slightly at the edges. "But I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if the truth is enough when someone has enough money to make lies sound better." Jack crossed the barn and stood in front of her. He did not touch her. He simply stood close enough that she could feel his presence, the solid weight of him. "We have 6 weeks, he said. "That's 6 weeks to build something that no amount of money can tear down." Sarah looked at him. "And what if we can't?" "Then we fight anyway." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, the way she always did when she decided something. "All right," she said. 6 weeks. The next morning Briggs arrived. He looked tired, the way a man looks when he has ridden out early to deliver news he wishes he did not have to deliver. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee from Sarah, and he laid out what he knew. "Eleanor Wright is not giving up," he said. "She has filed an appeal with the territorial court in Cheyenne. She is arguing that Judge Hartley's decision was influenced by emotion rather than evidence, and she is claiming that new information has come to light that casts doubt on the legitimacy of the marriage." "What new information?" Jack asked. Briggs hesitated. "She has hired a private investigator," he said. "He has been asking questions in Laramie, in the surrounding area, and apparently in the town where you lived before you came to Wyoming, Jack." Jack went very still. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about Margaret." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Sarah's hands went still on the table. Jack did not move. "What about her?" he said. "He has been asking about the circumstances of her death," Briggs said. "About how she died. About whether there was anyone else involved. About whether—" He stopped. "About whether there was any suggestion of wrongdoing." Jack's face did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A door opening that had been closed for a very long time. "Margaret died of a fever," he said. "She was sick for 3 weeks. I sat with her every night. I held her hand when she passed. There was no wrongdoing. There was nothing but a sickness that wouldn't break, and a doctor who came too late." "I believe you," Briggs said. "But Eleanor Wright's investigator is not interested in the truth. He is interested in creating doubt. If he can suggest that there was something irregular about your first wife's death, that casts doubt on your character, and that casts doubt on the marriage." "That's not evidence," Sarah said. "That's innuendo." "It is, but in a territorial appeal, with a different judge, innuendo can be enough to create reasonable doubt. And Eleanor Wright has enough money to make that innuendo sound very convincing." The room was quiet. Emma's voice carried from the barn, where she was having her morning conversation with Biscuit. The sound was steady and cheerful, completely unaware of the weight that had settled over the kitchen table. "What do we do?" Sarah said. Briggs looked at her. "We prepare," he said. "We gather every piece of evidence we can about Jack's character, about his first marriage, about the circumstances of Margaret's death. We find witnesses who can testify to his integrity. We build a case that is so solid that innuendo cannot crack it. And if we can't, Jack said. Briggs looked at him. Then we hope that the truth is enough, because that's all we have. After Briggs left, Jack did not go to the barn. He walked to the east paddock, where the creek ran along the fence line, and he stood looking at the water. He heard footsteps behind him, soft in the grass, and he knew it was Sarah before she spoke. "You want to tell me about her?" Sarah asked. She stood beside him, not touching, just present. Jack was quiet for a long time. The creek murmured over the stones. The wind moved through the grass. "Margaret was the opposite of me in every way that mattered," he said finally. "She talked to everyone. She never met a stranger. She could walk into a room full of people she didn't know and leave 2 hours later with 5 new friends. I used to watch her and wonder how she did it, how she just opened herself up to people like that without being afraid." He paused. "She got sick in the spring. It started as a cough, the kind that doesn't go away. By the time the doctor came, it was in her lungs. She was gone 3 weeks later." His voice did not break, but it held the weight of the memory carefully, like something fragile. "I sat with her every night. I held her hand. I told her I loved her. And when she stopped breathing, I was still holding her hand." He looked at the creek. "I buried her on the hill behind the house. There's a tree there, a cottonwood. She used to sit under it and read. I put a stone at the base of it. No name, just a stone. She would have understood." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What would she think of all this?" Jack considered the question. "She would have liked Emma immediately," he said. "Emma would have been her favorite person in the world within 5 minutes." He paused. "And she would have liked you." "How do you know?" "Because she would have seen the same thing I see." Sarah did not ask what that was. She stood beside him in the afternoon light, and they watched the creek together, and the silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that two people share when they are learning to trust each other with the heavy things. That night, after Emma was asleep, Jack sat on the porch. The stars were out. Wyoming stars, more of them than a man could count, scattered across the sky like seeds thrown by a generous hand. He heard the door open behind him, and Sarah came out and sat on the step beside him. She did not say anything. She just sat, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her in the cooling air. "I want to tell you something," she said after a while, "and I want you to hear it and not say anything back. Not tonight." Jack waited. "When I woke up in that bed," she said, "and I saw you standing in the doorway, I did not trust you. I did not trust anything. The last thing I remembered was a man's hands on me and the sound of my husband dying. I did not know if you were one of them or not. I did not know if I would ever be able to trust a man's face again." She looked down at her hands. "And then Emma told me you were okay. She said she checked you out. And I wanted to believe her because she has always been a better judge of people than I am. But I couldn't. Not yet." She looked up at the stars. "It took me longer than I want to admit to realize that she was right. You gave us a home. You gave Emma a horse. You married a stranger to protect her. You stood in a courtroom and offered to give away everything you own." She turned her head and looked at him. "I don't know what this is, Jack. I don't know if it's going to be anything or if it's just a moment that we'll look back on someday. But I need you to know that I am starting to trust you. And that is not something I thought I would ever be able to say again." Jack did not speak. He sat beside her in the dark, and he let her words settle into the space between them. The stars wheeled overhead. The night air was cool and clean, and for the first time in a very long time, Jack felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The next few days passed in a flurry of preparation. Jack rode out to gather more affidavits. Sarah organized the documentation they already had and wrote letters to people who had known Margaret, asking them to write statements about the circumstances of her death. She wrote to the doctor who had treated Margaret, though she knew he had passed away 2 years ago, and to the neighbors who had brought food during those 3 weeks. Every letter was a small act of hope, a thread woven into a net that they would cast in front of the territorial judge. Emma noticed the shift in the house. She did not ask about it directly, but she watched everything with those eyes that missed nothing. One evening, she came to Jack in the barn while he was saddling the bay mare for a ride out to the far pasture. "Is the bad lady coming back?" she asked. Jack stopped what he was doing and crouched down in front of her. "She's trying," he said, "but we're going to stop her again." "How do you know?" "Because we have something she doesn't have." "What?" Jack looked at her, at the serious eyes and the determined chin. "We have each other." Emma considered this. "That's not a legal argument," she said. "No," Jack agreed, "but it's the truth, and the truth is harder to beat than a legal argument." Emma nodded. "Biscuit says we're going to win." "Does she?" "She says she knows it the way she knows when the hay is sweet." Jack smiled. "Then I guess it's settled." Emma turned to go, then stopped. "Jack?" "Yeah?" "If the bad lady comes here, I'll hit her with my branch." Jack looked at his daughter. "I don't think that'll be necessary," he said, "but I appreciate you being ready." Emma nodded once, satisfied, and walked out of the barn. The letter from Cheyenne arrived on a Tuesday. Jack was in the north pasture when Sarah found him. She rode out on the bay mare, which surprised him because she had not ridden since she came to the ranch. She pulled up beside him and handed him the envelope. Her face was pale. He opened it. The territorial court had granted Eleanor Wright's appeal. A new hearing had been scheduled for 4 weeks from that date. The judge assigned was a man named Harrison Crane, no relation to the sheriff, a judge known for his strict adherence to procedure and his impatience with emotional appeals. Jack read the letter again. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket. 4 weeks, Sarah said. "We can be ready." Jack looked at the horizon. The sun was starting to descend, casting long shadows across the pasture. The ranch house was a small shape in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney, a curl of warmth against the vastness of the sky. "We'll be ready," he said. But as he said it, he felt the weight of the weeks pressing down on him, the knowledge that this time Eleanor Wright would not be caught off guard. She would have her best lawyers, her best evidence, her best strategy. And they would walk into that courtroom with nothing but the truth and each other. He hoped that would be enough. He had to believe it would be, because the alternative was not something he could afford to consider. The 4 weeks compressed into something that felt both impossibly short and agonizingly long. Every morning Jack woke before dawn and went through his chores with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned to let his hands work, while his mind ran ahead to what was coming. The appeal hearing in Cheyenne hung over everything, a storm on the horizon that nobody mentioned but nobody forgot. Sarah moved through the house with the same focused efficiency she had shown during the first hearing, organizing documents, writing letters, preparing for a fight that would be fought in a larger courtroom, with a judge who had never seen Emma's face or heard her voice. She did not complain. She did not falter. But Jack noticed that she slept less, that the circles under her eyes deepened as the weeks passed, and that she stood at the kitchen window every evening, watching the road, as if she expected Eleanor Wright's carriage to appear at any moment. The private investigator came to the ranch on a Thursday. Jack was in the barn when he heard a horse approach at a gait that was not hurried but deliberate, the pace of a man who wanted to be seen coming. He stepped out into the yard and found a lean man in a dark coat dismounting at the fence. The man tipped his hat and smiled the smile of someone who had nothing to fear from the people he was about to speak to. "Mr. Mercer," the man said, "my name is Daniel Hoyle. I've been hired by Mrs. Eleanor Wright to conduct an investigation into certain matters relevant to the upcoming hearing." Jack stood where he was, arms crossed, face flat. "I know who you are. What do you want?" Hoyle smiled again and reached into his coat, producing a small notebook. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about your first wife, Margaret Mercer. I understand she passed away several years ago." 8 years, Jack said, "and I have nothing to say to you about it." "I understand your reluctance," Hoyle said, "but I am authorized to inform you that if you refuse to cooperate, I will be forced to draw inferences from your silence. The court may also draw inferences." Jack took a step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply moved closer, and something in the way he moved made Hoyle take a small step backward. "You can draw whatever inferences you want," Jack said. "I buried my wife on that hill 8 years ago. I held her hand while she died. There is nothing in that story that will help Eleanor Wright, no matter how you twist it. Now get off my land." Hoyle looked at him for a moment, then closed his notebook and put it away. "I'll be in Cheyenne for the hearing, Mr. Mercer. I look forward to speaking with you there." He mounted his horse, turned, and rode back down the track without looking back. Jack stood in the yard and watched him go. His hands were shaking, but it was not fear. It was anger, the deep and quiet kind that had nowhere to go but inward. Sarah came out of the house. She had been watching from the window. She stood beside him and said nothing, but her presence was enough. After a long moment she said, "He's going to try to make it look like something it wasn't. I know. He can't. There's nothing to find. I know that too. But he doesn't have to find anything. He just has to make it sound like there might be something to find. That's how this works." Sarah looked at the dust settling on the road where Hoyle had disappeared. "Then we make it impossible for him to sound convincing." She turned to Jack. "Who else was there? Who else sat with Margaret while she was sick? Who else saw how you cared for her?" Jack thought for a moment. "The neighbors brought food. The Duncans. They came every other day. They saw me with her. They saw what I did. Can they testify to that? Will they come to Cheyenne? I don't know. They're old. The Duncans moved to Colorado 2 years ago. I don't know if I can find them." "Then we find them," Sarah said. "We write to them. We find someone else. We leave no room for his insinuations to take hold." Jack looked at her. She stood in the yard with the fading light behind her, her jaw set, her hands planted on her hips, and he saw in her the same stubborn refusal to quit that he had seen in Emma on that first day. "All right," he said. "We find them." The letter to the Duncans went out the next morning. Jack wrote it himself, 3 pages of careful handwriting, explaining the situation and asking if they would be willing to provide a sworn statement about the care he had given Margaret in her final weeks. He did not know if the letter would reach them. The last address he had for them was a general delivery in a town he had never heard of, but he sent it anyway, because doing something was better than doing nothing. Sarah, meanwhile, had been writing to every person she could think of who had known Jack in the years before Margaret's death. She wrote to the doctor's widow, to a neighbor who had moved to Nebraska, to a merchant in Laramie who had sold Jack the lumber for Margaret's coffin. She wrote with the same systematic thoroughness she had used to organize the documents for the first hearing, and Jack watched her work and felt something shift in his chest that he was still learning to name. Emma, for her part, had developed a new habit. She had started drawing pictures. They were not pictures of horses or trees or the house. They were pictures of a small figure holding a branch standing in front of a larger figure in a bed. She drew them with the focused intensity of a child working through something that had no words. Sarah noticed but did not ask. She simply collected the drawings and put them in a folder, the way she collected everything that mattered. 2 weeks passed. The letter from the Duncans did not come. A response from the doctor's widow arrived, but it was brief and unhelpful. She had been living with her daughter in Oregon for 6 years and remembered little of that time. The merchant in Laramie had died the previous winter. One by one, the threads they had reached for slipped through their fingers. Jack sat at the kitchen table one evening, staring at the thin stack of responses, and felt the weight of the hearing pressing down on him in a way he had not anticipated. "It's not enough," he said. Sarah looked up from the stew she was stirring. "It's what we have. It's not enough. Eleanor Wright has a private investigator and 3 lawyers and a judge who doesn't know us from strangers. We have a stack of letters that say nothing." Sarah set down the spoon and crossed to the table. She sat across from him and looked at him with those careful, measuring eyes. "We have more than that," she said. "We have the truth. We have each other. We have a child who stood guard over her mother for 2 days with a broken branch. That is not nothing, Jack. It might be nothing to Judge Crane. Briggs said he doesn't care about emotional appeals. He cares about procedure and evidence." "Then we give him evidence." Sarah reached out and took his hand, the first time she had done so without being prompted. "We show him that we are a family, not because of a piece of paper, but because we chose each other. That is evidence, Jack. It is the best evidence there is." Jack looked at her hand on his. He looked at her face, tired and determined and beautiful in the lamplight. And he felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the quiet certainty that he was not alone. That night, after Emma was asleep, Jack walked up the hill behind the house. The cottonwood tree stood dark against the stars. He knelt beside the stone at its base and placed his hand on it. "I'm sorry I haven't come up here in a while," he said. "Things have been complicated." The wind moved through the leaves. "I met someone, Margaret. Her name is Sarah. She has a daughter named Emma. And I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I'm doing it right. But I'm trying." He paused. "I think you would have liked them. I think you would have told me to stop being an old fool and just live my life." He smiled, a small and sad smile. "You always did know what to say." He stayed there for a long time, sitting in the dark under the cottonwood, and when he finally walked back down the hill, the house was lit with a warm glow from the kitchen window, and he could see Sarah moving inside, and the weight in his chest had not lifted, but it had shifted. The week before the hearing, Thomas Briggs arrived with news that changed everything. He sat at the kitchen table, accepted coffee, and laid a piece of paper in front of Jack and Sarah. "Eleanor Wright has filed a motion to have the marriage declared invalid," he said. "She is arguing that because the marriage was entered into under duress, specifically the duress of an impending custody hearing, it lacks legal standing. If the judge grants this motion, your marriage would be annulled, and Sarah would be left without any claim to a stable home." "Duress," Jack said. "She's claiming we were forced into it." "Not forced," Briggs said, "but she is arguing that the circumstances created a pressure that made the marriage not a free choice. It's a creative legal argument, and with Judge Crane, it might work." Sarah's hands were flat on the table. "What does this mean for the custody issue?" "If the marriage is annulled, the court reverts to the original question. Does Sarah have a stable home for Emma? And without the marriage, she is a widow with no fixed residence and no income, living on the charity of a man she is not married to." Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. "So we lose either way," he said. "If the marriage is real, it's fraudulent. If it's not real, Sarah has no home. She's made it so that no matter what we do, we can't win." Briggs nodded slowly. "That is the position she has constructed." The room was quiet. Emma's voice carried from the barn where she was having her evening conversation with Biscuit. The sound was steady and cheerful, completely unaware of the walls closing in around her. "Then we change the position," Sarah said. "Jack and I get married again." Jack looked at her. "What?" "We get married again." "A real wedding. In a church, with witnesses, with a ceremony. We make it so public and so genuine that no one can claim it was done under duress. We're already married. We're married on paper in front of a justice of the peace," Sarah said. "That's different. We do it again, properly. We show the court that this is not a convenience. It is a choice, freely made." Jack looked at Briggs. Briggs was frowning. "It's risky," he said. "If Judge Crane sees it as an attempt to manipulate the court, it could backfire." "Then we make sure he doesn't see it that way," Sarah said. "We make sure he sees exactly what it is. Two people who have chosen to build a life together." She looked at Jack. "I know this is not what you signed up for," she said. "I know you married me to protect Emma, not because you wanted this, but I'm asking you anyway. I'm asking you to marry me for real, Jack, not for the court, for us." Jack looked at her across the table. The lamplight caught the lines of her face, the weariness and the hope mixed together. He thought about the first morning he had seen her, unconscious and broken in the dirt. He thought about the day she had walked to the kitchen table for the first time, the stubborn set of her jaw. He thought about the way she had held Emma's hand in the courtroom, the way she had stood beside him through every blow, every setback. "It hasn't been for the court for a long time," he said quietly. "Not for me." Sarah's breath caught. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily, but something moved across her face that was deeper than tears. "Then we do it," she said. "We do it right." The wedding was 3 days later, in the small church in Laramie that Reverend Wells served. There were no carriages, no flowers, no guests beyond Thomas Briggs and Sheriff Crane, who had agreed to stand as witnesses. Emma stood between them, as she had stood before the justice of the peace, holding both their hands. But this time, Something was different. This time, Jack looked at Sarah as the Reverend spoke the words, and he saw her not as a woman he had married to win a legal battle, but as a woman he had chosen, freely and fully, to stand beside. "I, Sarah, take you, Jack, to be my husband." Her voice was steady. Her eyes never left his. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Jack heard the words and felt them land somewhere deep in his chest, a place that had been closed for so long he had forgotten it existed. "I, Jack, take you, Sarah, to be my wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." He said the words and meant them in a way he had not meant anything in years. Reverend Wells pronounced them man and wife. Emma looked up at them with her serious eyes. "Are we a family now?" she asked, the same question she had asked before. Jack looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at him. And then, for the first time in front of anyone, Jack knelt down and looked at Emma directly. "We were a family the day I found you on that ridge," he said. "We just needed to catch up to what we already were." Emma studied him for a moment. Then she nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said. "Can we go home now? Biscuit needs to be told about this." They rode home in the afternoon light. Sarah on the bay mare beside Jack. Emma in front of Jack on his horse, leaning back against him with the trusting ease of a child who had decided that this was her place. The road stretched ahead, the ranch appeared on the horizon, and Jack felt something he had not felt in 8 years. The quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But when they crested the last rise and the house came into full view, Jack saw something that made him pull the reins hard. A plume of smoke was rising from the east paddock. Not the thin gray smoke of a cook fire or the chimney. Thick, black, angry smoke, the kind that came from something burning that was not supposed to burn. He kicked his horse into a gallop, holding Emma tight against him, and behind him he heard Sarah's horse following. When they reached the paddock, Jack saw what was burning. It was the hay shed, the small structure where he stored the winter feed. Flames were pouring from the roof, and the dry wood was catching fast. There was no one around. The fire had started on its own, in a place where no fire should have been. Jack handed Emma down to Sarah and ran for the well. He worked the pump, filled buckets, passed them to Sarah, who threw water at the base of the flames. Emma stood at the edge of the yard, watching with wide eyes, her small hands clenched at her sides. They fought the fire for 30 minutes. By the time it was out, the shed was gone, a blackened skeleton of itself, and the hay within it had turned to ash. Jack stood in the smoldering remains, breathing hard, his hands blistered from the pump handle. He looked at the ground around the shed. There were footprints. Not his, not Sarah's. Boot prints leading from the road to the shed and back. Someone had come while they were gone. Someone had set the fire. Sarah stood beside him, looking at the same prints. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "She's not just trying to take Emma anymore," she said. "She's trying to take everything." Jack looked at the blackened ruins of the shed. He looked at the boot prints leading away. He looked at Emma, standing at the edge of the yard, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the smoke rise into the evening sky. "No," he said quietly. "She's trying to make sure we have nothing left to fight for. But she doesn't understand. It was never about what we have. It was about who we are, and she can't burn that." He put his arm around Sarah. They stood together in the fading light, looking at the destruction, and they did not turn away. The hearing in Cheyenne was 6 days away, and they were still standing. The smoke from the burned hay shed hung in the air for 2 days. It settled into the fabric of Jack's coat, into the curtains Sarah had hung in the kitchen, into Emma's hair when she came in from the barn. No matter how many times they opened the windows, the smell lingered, a constant reminder that someone had come onto their land with the intention of taking everything they had built. Jack spent the morning after the fire walking the perimeter of the property. He found more boot prints near the east fence line, leading to a place where the wire had been cut and loosely reattached, just enough to look intact but easy to push through. He found the remnants of a matchbook near the base of a sagebrush, the kind that came from saloons in Laramie. He pocketed the matchbook and stood looking out at the flat expanse of land that stretched toward the road. They had been watched. Someone had known they would be gone for the wedding. Someone had waited for the right moment. He thought about Daniel Hoyle, the private investigator with the easy smile and the notebook. He thought about Eleanor Wright sitting in her Boston mansion, giving orders that men in Wyoming carried out. He thought about how far she was willing to go to take Emma. That evening, Sheriff Bill Crane rode out from Laramie. Jack had sent word with a passing trader. Crane dismounted and walked the perimeter with Jack, examining the boot prints, the cut fence, the remnants of the matchbook. He was quiet for a long time. "This was deliberate," Crane said finally. "I'll ride out to the road and see if any of the neighbors saw someone passing through. But I'll be honest with you, Jack. There's not much I can do without a witness. The matchbook could have blown in from anywhere." "I know." Crane looked at the blackened remains of the shed. "You have any idea who would do this?" Jack met his eyes. "I have a very good idea." Crane nodded slowly. He did not ask for details. He had been in the courtroom. He had seen Eleanor Wright. "I'll do what I can," he said. "But you should know, if there's a next time, it might not be a shed." He left those words hanging in the air as he mounted his horse and rode back toward Laramie. Sarah was in the kitchen when Jack came inside. She was kneading dough for bread, her hands moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who needed to keep her hands busy while her mind worked. Emma sat at the table, drawing. She had drawn the fire. The picture showed a red and orange shape with black lines rising from it, and 3 small figures standing at a distance. One of the figures had a stick in its hand. Jack looked at the drawing and felt something cold move through him. "Emma," he said gently, sitting down beside her, "can you tell me about this?" Emma looked at the drawing. She did not look at him. "The bad people came," she said. "They made the fire, but we put it out." "How do you know they were bad people?" Emma looked up at him with those eyes that had seen too much. "Because good people don't burn things." Jack had no answer for that. He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder. She did not lean into him, but she did not pull away. "We're going to Cheyenne in a few days," he said. "To stop the bad lady." "I know." "Are you scared?" Emma thought about it. "No," she said, "because you and Mama are with me." She went back to her drawing. Jack looked at Sarah across the room. Sarah had stopped kneading the dough. She was watching them both, her face unreadable. She met his eyes and nodded once, a small nod that said everything she could not say in front of Emma. 2 days before the hearing, a letter arrived from Thomas Briggs. It was brief and direct. Judge Harrison Crane had denied the motion to annul the marriage. The wedding in the church with witnesses had been sufficient to demonstrate that the union was freely entered into. But Briggs added a warning. Eleanor Wright had filed additional documentation. She had obtained an affidavit from a woman in Boston who claimed to have witnessed Sarah behaving improperly in the months before Robert's death. The affidavit was vague and unsubstantiated, but it was designed to cast doubt on Sarah's character as a mother. Jack read the letter aloud to Sarah in the kitchen. When he finished, neither of them spoke for a long moment. "She's making things up," Sarah said. Her voice was flat, controlled. "I know. This woman, I don't even know who she is. I've never done anything improper in my life." "I know that too. But Judge Crane doesn't know me. He reads that affidavit and he wonders. And that wonder is enough to tip the scale." Jack folded the letter and put it in his pocket. "Then we make sure the scale tips the other way." "How?" "By being who we are. By showing up and telling the truth and letting him see what Eleanor Wright really is." Sarah looked at him. "You really believe that's enough?" Jack thought about it. He thought about the burned shed, the boot prints, the affidavit from a woman who had never met Sarah. He thought about the weight of Eleanor Wright's money pressing down on them from a distance. "I have to believe it," he said, "because if I don't, then I've got nothing left." Sarah crossed the room and stood in front of him. She reached up and put her hand on his cheek. "You've got more than you think," she said. "You've got a daughter who trusts you. You've got a wife who is learning to. You've got land that your father built, and a house that is starting to feel like a home." She paused. And you've got a stubborn woman who is not going to let Eleanor Wright take her child. That matters." Jack covered her hand with his own. "I know," he said. "I just needed to hear it." They left for Cheyenne at dawn the next morning. The wagon was packed with what they needed for 3 days: blankets, food, water, a change of clothes for each of them, and the folder of documents Sarah had organized with military precision. Emma sat in the wagon bed on a pile of blankets, her branch beside her. She had insisted on bringing it. "For protection," she said. Jack did not argue. The road to Cheyenne was long and rough, a 2-day journey if the weather held and the wheels did not break. They traveled in silence for the first few hours, each lost in their own thoughts. The landscape changed as they moved east, the open plains giving way to rolling hills, the grass turning from golden to brown. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for anything that moved. He did not trust that Eleanor Wright would let them reach Cheyenne without interference. They stopped at midday to rest the horses. Sarah passed out cold biscuits and dried meat. Emma ate without enthusiasm, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "How much longer?" she asked. "We'll make it to the way station by nightfall," Jack said. "Then we ride into Cheyenne tomorrow morning." Emma nodded and went back to her biscuit. She did not ask any more questions. The way station was a small building at a crossroads, run by a man named Potter, who had the weathered face of someone who had spent 40 years in the Wyoming wind. He offered them a room with 2 beds and a meal of stew that was better than Jack had expected. Emma fell asleep before the sun had fully set, her branch laid carefully on the floor beside her bed. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, watching her daughter breathe. Jack sat by the window, looking out at the darkening road. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. "I'm thinking that we're 3 years too late for this fight," Jack said. "We should have seen it coming. We should have been ready. How could we have been ready for Eleanor Wright? I don't know, but I should have known that a woman like that doesn't give up after one loss. She's not fighting for Emma. She's fighting to win. And that makes her dangerous in a way that has nothing to do with love." Sarah was quiet. Then she said, "I think you underestimate what we have." Jack turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Eleanor Wright has money and lawyers and a private investigator, but she doesn't have what we have." She looked at Emma, then back at Jack. "She doesn't have a child who would stand guard over her mother for 2 days with a broken branch. She doesn't have a man who would marry a stranger to protect her. She doesn't have the kind of love that grows out of hardship and choice." Jack looked at her across the dim room. "You really believe that?" "I have to," she said. "Same as you." They sat in the silence of the way station, the wind pressing against the walls, and Jack felt something settle in his chest. Not certainty, not yet, but something close. He woke in the middle of the night to a sound. It was not loud, just a scrape, the kind of sound a boot makes against wood when someone is trying to be quiet. Jack was on his feet before he was fully awake, his hand closing around the rifle he had leaned against the wall. He crossed to the door and pressed his ear against it. Another scrape. Then footsteps moving away. He opened the door slowly and stepped into the main room of the way station. The fire had burned down to embers. The room was empty. But the front door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. Jack crossed to the door and looked out. The moon was half full, casting pale light across the yard. He saw a figure near the edge of the trees, just a shape, gone before he could be sure he had seen it. He stood there for a long time, rifle in hand, watching. Nothing moved. He closed the door and barred it. He did not sleep again that night. They reached Cheyenne by mid-morning. The city was larger than Laramie, with brick buildings and board sidewalks and a courthouse that dominated the main square. It had the look of a place that was trying to become something more than a frontier town, and the courthouse was its statement of intent. Jack pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a boarding house that Briggs had recommended. He helped Sarah and Emma down, and they carried their belongings inside. The room was small but clean, with 2 beds and a window that looked out onto the street. Emma immediately went to the window and stood on tiptoe to look out. "There's a lot of people," she said. "This is a big place." "We won't be here long," Sarah said. "Just until the hearing is over." "And then we go home?" Emma asked. "And then we go home." Emma nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the window. That afternoon, Jack went to meet with Thomas Briggs at his temporary office near the courthouse. Briggs looked tired, the kind of tired that came from too many nights preparing cases that felt impossible. He shook Jack's hand and gestured to a chair. "The hearing is scheduled for 9 tomorrow morning," Briggs said. "Judge Crane is known for starting on time and not tolerating delays. Eleanor Wright's team has already arrived. I saw Caldwell in the courthouse hallway this morning." "Did you see Eleanor?" "No, but she's here. Her carriage is at the hotel on Main Street." Jack absorbed this. "What about the affidavit, the one from the woman in Boston?" Briggs's expression tightened. "I've tried to find out who she is. The name on the affidavit is Margaret Hollister. I did some checking. She worked as a maid in the Wright household for 12 years. She left shortly after Robert married Sarah. It's possible she wrote the affidavit because she was paid to, or because she genuinely believes what she wrote. Either way, it's going to be difficult to discredit her without a witness of our own who can speak to Sarah's character during that time. We don't have anyone from Boston. We don't know anyone in Boston." "I know." Briggs leaned back. "But we do have something else. I've spoken with the clerk of the court. He told me that Judge Crane has a reputation for being strict, but he also has a reputation for being fair. If your testimony is consistent and credible, and if Sarah's testimony is consistent and credible, he may weigh that more heavily than a paid affidavit from a former maid." "May," Jack said. "That's not certainty." "No," Briggs said. "It's not, but it's what we have." Jack walked back to the boarding house through the crowded streets of Cheyenne. The city was alive with the noise of commerce and conversation, wagons and horses and people moving in every direction. He felt out of place, a man of the open plains surrounded by buildings and strangers. He found Sarah and Emma in the room. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, a book open in her lap, but she was not reading. Emma was on the floor, drawing. She had drawn a picture of a courthouse with a large door and 3 figures walking through it. "I drew us," Emma said, pointing. "That's you, that's Mama, and that's me. And that's the judge." She pointed to a figure behind a tall desk. "He looks nice. I gave him a mustache." Jack looked at the drawing. The judge had a kind face and a very large mustache. "He does look nice," Jack said. "Maybe he'll be on our side." Emma considered this. "I think he will, because I drew him that way." Jack crouched down beside her. "You know, sometimes things work out the way we draw them." Emma looked at him with her serious eyes. "Is that true?" "I hope so," Jack said. "I really hope so." The evening before the hearing, they ate a quiet meal in the boarding house dining room. The other guests were a traveling salesman and an elderly couple on their way to Denver. Nobody paid much attention to the family at the corner table. After dinner, they went back to their room. Sarah tucked Emma into bed. Emma was asleep within minutes, her branch placed carefully on the floor beside her bed. Sarah sat on the edge of her own bed, looking at Jack. He was standing by the window, looking out at the darkened street. "Jack," she said. He turned. "What if we lose?" The question hung in the air between them. Jack crossed the room and sat on the bed across from her. "Then we keep fighting," he said. "We find another way. We don't stop. And if there is no other way?" He looked at her. Her face was tired, the lines deeper than they had been a few weeks ago. She had been carrying so much for so long, and he saw in that moment how heavy the weight was. "There is always another way," he said. "I didn't believe that before I met you. I spent 8 years thinking that the only way forward was to keep going alone. But that wasn't true. There was always another way. I just couldn't see it." Sarah reached out and took his hand. "You really mean that?" "I do." She held his hand for a long moment. Then she said, "I never thought I would find someone like you. After Robert died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my years just trying to keep Emma safe and alive, and that would be enough." She paused. "But then you came, and you gave us a home, and you gave Emma a horse, and you gave me a reason to believe that maybe the world is not as cruel as I thought it was." Jack did not know what to say. He squeezed her hand. "We'll get through this," he said. "Together." Sarah nodded. She did not let go of his hand. They sat like that in the quiet room, the night pressing against the windows, and the hearing waiting for them in the morning like a storm on the horizon. Neither of them slept well, but they did not let go. The morning of the hearing came gray and cold. A low ceiling of clouds had moved in overnight, pressing down on Cheyenne like a lid, and the wind that swept through the streets carried the smell of rain that had not yet fallen. Jack woke before dawn and lay still for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the boarding house coming alive around him. Footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards, a voice calling from the kitchen. Sarah was already awake. He could tell by the even rhythm of her breathing, the way it changed when she was pretending to sleep but wasn't. He turned his head and found her looking at him from the other bed. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said. Emma slept through the alarm. She slept through Jack moving about the room. She slept through the sounds of breakfast being laid out downstairs. It was only when Sarah gently shook her shoulder that she opened her eyes, and when she did, she looked at them both with the calm, clear gaze of someone who had already decided how the day was going to go. "Is it time?" she asked. "It's time," Sarah said. Emma got up without complaint, dressed herself, and ate her breakfast with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything else. She had put her branch in the wagon before they left the ranch, and she had carried it into the boarding house and leaned it against the wall beside her bed. Now she looked at it, then at Jack. "Should I bring it?" she asked. Jack considered the question. The branch had become a symbol of everything Emma was, everything she had survived, everything she refused to surrender. But a Cheyenne courtroom was not a Wyoming ridge, and he did not know how Judge Crane would view a child carrying a weapon into his courtroom. "Leave it here," he said. "It'll be here when we get back." Emma nodded, accepting this without argument. She touched the branch once, briefly, and then turned and walked to the door. The courthouse was a block and a half from the boarding house. They walked in silence, the wind pushing against them, the gray sky pressing down. Jack walked with Emma on one side and Sarah on the other, and he felt the combined weight of their presence like a charge in the air, something that could be released one way or another. The courthouse steps were wide and worn. A group of men stood near the entrance, talking in low voices, and they fell silent as Jack, Sarah, and Emma passed. Jack did not look at them. He kept his eyes fixed on the doors. Inside, the hallway was crowded with people waiting for various proceedings. Jack spotted Thomas Briggs near the door to the courtroom, speaking with a man he did not recognize. Briggs saw them and excused himself, crossing the hall with quick, purposeful steps. "You're here," he said. "Good. Judge Crane has already taken the bench. We'll be called in within a few minutes." "Where is Eleanor Wright?" Sarah asked. "Already inside. She arrived early. She has Caldwell with her and 2 other attorneys I don't recognize." Briggs hesitated. "And Daniel Hoyle is in the hallway, waiting to be called as a witness." Jack felt something tighten in his chest. He had known Hoyle would be there, but hearing it made it real. "We're ready," he said. Briggs nodded, though his face did not look entirely convinced. A bailiff appeared at the courtroom door and called their names. Jack, Sarah, and Emma followed Briggs inside. The courtroom was larger than the one in Laramie. The ceiling was higher, the benches were fuller, and the judge's bench was raised on a platform that made the man sitting behind it seem larger than he was. Judge Harrison Crane was in his 60s, with a narrow face, gray hair combed back, and the kind of eyes that had been looking at people for long enough to have formed permanent judgments about most of them. He did not smile when they entered. He looked at them over the top of his spectacles, and then he looked down at the papers in front of him, and he began. "This court is now in session for the matter of Wright versus Mercer, regarding the custody of the minor child Emma Rose Wright." His voice was flat, without warmth. "Counsel may proceed." Caldwell rose. He looked different than he had in Laramie, more confident, more prepared. He walked to the center of the courtroom and addressed the judge with the measured cadence of a man who had rehearsed his opening statement until it had become reflex. "Your Honor, this case is about the best interests of a child. Emma Rose Wright is 6 years old. She is the sole heir to a significant estate, and she is caught between 2 forces, a grandmother who can provide her with every material advantage life has to offer, and a mother who, through no fault of her own, is unable to provide the stability that a growing child requires." He paused. "We are not here to question Mrs. Mercer's love for her daughter. We are here to determine whether that love, In the absence of stable housing, stable income, and a stable family structure, is sufficient to meet the child's needs. We have evidence that the marriage upon which Mrs. Mercer's claim of stability rests was entered into under circumstances that raise serious questions. We have evidence that Mrs. Mercer's current living situation is precarious and dependent on the goodwill of a man she barely knew before she married him. And we have evidence that the child's grandmother is prepared to provide a home, an education, and a future that will give Emma opportunities her mother simply cannot provide. He sat down. Briggs rose. He did not approach the center of the room. He stood beside the table where Jack and Sarah sat, and he spoke directly to the judge. Your Honor, this case is not about material advantages. It is about a child who stood guard over her unconscious mother for 2 days with a broken branch. It is about a mother who survived an attack that killed her husband and then fought to keep her daughter with her through every legal challenge that was thrown at her. It is about a man who married a stranger to protect a child he had known for 10 days. The respondent's case is built on insinuation and paid affidavits, not on the reality of what this family actually is. He paused. We will show that the marriage between Jack Mercer and Sarah Mercer is genuine. We will show that the home they have built, while modest, is stable and loving. And we will show that Emma Wright is thriving in that home in ways that no amount of money can replicate. He sat down. Judge Crane looked at him, then at Caldwell. Call your first witness. Caldwell called Daniel Hoyle. The private investigator took the stand with the easy confidence of a man who had been in courtrooms many times before. He was sworn in, and Caldwell walked him through his testimony with practiced precision. Hoyle described his investigation into Jack Mercer's background. He spoke about interviews he had conducted with neighbors, with merchants, with anyone who had known Jack in the years before Sarah and Emma arrived. He spoke about the circumstances of Margaret Mercer's death. The records show that Mrs. Mercer died of a fever, Hoyle said, but several individuals I spoke with expressed uncertainty about the exact cause. There were no witnesses to the final days of her illness beyond Mr. Mercer himself. The attending doctor passed away 2 years ago, and his records are not available. So there is no independent verification of what happened during Mrs. Mercer's final illness, Caldwell asked. That is correct, Hoyle said. The only account we have is Mr. Mercer's own testimony. Briggs rose for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who was not impressed. Mr. Hoyle, how much are you being paid for your services in this case? Hoyle did not flinch. My fee is standard for investigative work of this nature. How much? $15 a day, plus expenses. And how many days have you worked on this case? Approximately 20. So you have been paid approximately $300 to find evidence that casts doubt on Mr. Mercer's character. I have been paid to conduct a thorough investigation. The findings speak for themselves. And in your 20 days of investigation, did you find anyone who could provide evidence of any wrongdoing by Mr. Mercer in the death of his first wife? Hoyle hesitated. No. Did you find anyone who witnessed any conflict or tension between Mr. Mercer and his first wife? No. Did you find anyone who had anything negative to say about Mr. Mercer's character at all? Hoyle's jaw tightened. Several people expressed surprise at the speed of his remarriage. That is not what I asked. I asked if anyone had anything negative to say about his character. Hoyle paused. No. Thank you, Mr. Hoyle. That will be all. Caldwell's next witness was Margaret Hollister, the former maid from Boston. She was a thin woman in her 50s with a nervous manner and eyes that darted around the courtroom as if she were looking for an exit. She was sworn in, and Caldwell led her through her testimony. She stated that she had worked for the Wright family for 12 years, that she had known Sarah during the time Sarah was married to Robert, and that she had observed Sarah behaving inappropriately with other men on several occasions. What do you mean by inappropriately? Caldwell asked. She would spend time alone with men who were not her husband, Hollister said. She would take long walks with them, and she would return late. Did you ever witness any physical impropriety? I saw her embrace a man once in the garden. It was not her husband. Caldwell nodded gravely. And what was your relationship with the Wright family during this time? I was a trusted employee. I had worked for Mrs. Eleanor Wright for many years. And why did you leave that position? Hollister hesitated. I left of my own accord. I felt that the moral character of the household had declined. Briggs stood for a cross-examination. He approached the witness stand and looked at Margaret Hollister with the mild interest of a man examining a document he suspected was forged. Mrs. Hollister, how much are you being paid for your testimony today? Hollister's face went red. I am not being paid. I am here to tell the truth. Are you currently employed by Mrs. Eleanor Wright? No. Have you been offered any compensation for your travel to Cheyenne? My travel expenses were covered. By whom? By Mrs. Wright's legal team. I see. And can you provide the names of any witnesses who can corroborate your account of Mrs. Mercer's behavior? Hollister's mouth opened and closed. I did not keep a list. You made serious accusations about a woman's moral character, but you kept no list of witnesses, no record of dates, no record of times? I saw what I saw. And yet you waited 6 years to come forward with this information. Hollister said nothing. No further questions, Briggs said. Judge Crane looked at Hollister with an expression that was difficult to read. You may step down. Then Briggs called Sarah. She walked to the stand with the same straight-backed composure she had shown in Laramie. She was sworn in. Briggs asked her to describe her marriage to Robert Wright, her life in Boston, and the circumstances that led her to leave. She spoke about Robert's decision to walk away from his family's wealth, about their life together, about the attack that killed him. She spoke without self-pity, stating the facts as they were. And during your marriage to Robert, did you ever act in a manner that was inappropriate or unfaithful? Briggs asked. No, Sarah said. I loved my husband. I was faithful to him in every way. And the allegations made by Margaret Hollister? They are false. I never embraced another man. I never gave anyone reason to question my character. Why do you think Mrs. Hollister would make such claims? Caldwell objected. Judge Crane overruled. You may answer. Sarah looked at Margaret Hollister, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the floor. I think she was paid to say what she said, Sarah said quietly, and I think she needed the money badly enough to agree. No further questions, Briggs said. Caldwell's cross-examination was brief but pointed. He focused on Sarah's dependence on Jack. You have no income of your own, correct? Correct. You have no property of your own? Correct. You are entirely dependent on Mr. Mercer for your housing, your food, your transportation. I am, Sarah said, but that is not a sign of instability. That is what a marriage is. Two people building a life together. And if that marriage were to end, you would have nothing. Sarah met his eyes. If that marriage were to end, I would still have my daughter, and I would find a way to provide for her. I have done it before. Caldwell sat down. Then Briggs called Jack. Jack took the stand and was sworn in. He looked at Sarah, then at Emma, who was sitting in the front row of the benches, her hands folded in her lap, watching him with those serious eyes. Briggs asked him about his life before Sarah and Emma. He spoke about Margaret. He spoke about her illness, her death, the 3 weeks he had spent at her bedside. He spoke about the years of solitude that followed. And when you found Mrs. Mercer, Sarah, on the ridge, what made you stop? Briggs asked. Jack thought about it. I heard a scream, he said. It was a child's scream. And I knew, even before I saw her, that something was wrong. I couldn't ride past it. And you brought them to your ranch? Yes. And you married her? Yes. Why? Jack looked at Sarah. Because it was the only way to protect her. Because I couldn't stand by and watch a child be taken away from her mother by a woman who had never shown her any love. He paused. And because I knew, even then, that Sarah was someone worth fighting for. Caldwell's cross-examination was aggressive. He questioned Jack about Margaret's death, about the lack of witnesses, about the speed of his remarriage. You expect this court to believe that a man who lived alone for 8 years suddenly decided to marry a woman he had known for 10 days, out of pure altruism? Jack met his gaze. You can believe whatever you want. I know what I did and why I did it. And if the court finds that this marriage is not valid, what happens to Mrs. Mercer and Emma? They stay with me. Marriage or not, I'm not turning them out. "That's not a legal arrangement," Caldwell said. "That's charity." "That's family," Jack said. Briggs rested his case. Caldwell made his closing argument, emphasizing the lack of independent verification, the speed of the marriage, the material advantages Eleanor Wright could provide. Briggs made his closing argument, emphasizing the truth of what the family had built together. Then Judge Crane looked at the room. "I will take the matter under advisement," he said. "I will issue my ruling tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. He rose. The bailiff called for all to rise, and the courtroom emptied. They walked back to the boarding house in silence. The rain had started, a cold drizzle that soaked through their coats and dripped from the brim of Jack's hat. Emma did not complain. She held Sarah's hand and kept her eyes on the ground. The night was the longest of Jack's life. He did not sleep. He sat by the window, watching the rain fall on the empty street, listening to the sound of Sarah breathing in the other bed and the soft murmur of Emma talking in her sleep. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the hill behind the house, the cottonwood tree, the stone. He thought about the burned shed and the boot prints and the affidavit. He thought about the judge's face, the way he had looked at them during the closing arguments. He did not know what the morning would bring. But as the first light of dawn began to gray the sky, Jack heard Emma stir. She climbed out of bed and crossed the room to where he sat. She did not say anything. She simply climbed into his lap and leaned her head against his chest. He put his arm around her, and they sat together in the gray morning light, waiting. They sat together as the gray light slowly filled the room, Emma warm and still in Jack's lap, her breathing steady, her small hand resting on his arm. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to plan, nothing left to prepare. The words had all been spoken in that courtroom. The truth had been laid out like a hand of cards on a table. Now it was in the hands of a man they had never met, who would decide their future based on the weight of what he had heard. Sarah woke and found them there. She did not say anything. She simply sat on the edge of the bed and watched them, her face soft in the morning light, and Jack saw in her eyes the same quiet acceptance he felt in his own chest. Whatever happened, they had done everything they could. They had fought with everything they had, and they had fought together. They ate breakfast without appetite. The boarding house cook had laid out eggs and bacon and biscuits, but the food sat on their plates mostly untouched. Emma ate a single biscuit with the methodical slowness of a child who was not hungry but knew she should eat. Jack drank 2 cups of coffee that tasted like nothing. Sarah pushed her eggs around her plate and finally set down her fork. At 8:45, they put on their coats and walked back to the courthouse. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low and heavy, pressing down on the city like a held breath. The streets were quiet. The courthouse steps were wet, and their footsteps echoed in the hollow silence of the morning. The courtroom was already full when they arrived. Jack saw Eleanor Wright sitting at the prosecution table, her back straight, her hands folded, her face composed into an expression of patient certainty. She did not look at them. Caldwell sat beside her, his papers arranged in neat stacks. Daniel Hoyle sat in the back row, his notebook open on his knee. Jack, Sarah, and Emma took their seats at the defense table. Briggs was already there, his face unreadable. He nodded at them once and said nothing. The minutes passed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. And then the bailiff called for all to rise, and Judge Harrison Crane entered and took the bench. He did not sit down immediately. He stood behind the bench, looking at the room with those narrow, evaluating eyes. He held a piece of paper in his hand, but he did not look at it. He looked at the room. He looked at Eleanor Wright. He looked at Jack and Sarah. And then he looked at Emma, who sat between them, her hands folded, her chin up, her eyes fixed on him with the same steady gaze she had turned on Jack the first day they met. Judge Crane set the paper down. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he is not rushing. Then he put them back on and spoke. "I have reviewed the evidence presented in this case," he said. His voice was flat, unhurried. "I have considered the testimony of the witnesses. I have considered the documentation provided by both parties, and I have considered the arguments made by counsel." He paused. "This case is not about whether Eleanor Wright can provide material advantages for Emma Rose Wright. She clearly can. She has the resources, the home, and the social standing to offer the child a life of comfort and opportunity. He looked at Eleanor. But this case is also not about whether Sarah Mercer can provide those same advantages. She cannot. That is not in dispute. He turned his gaze to Jack and Sarah. What this case is about is whether the law should remove a child from her mother and place her with a grandmother she barely knows, on the grounds that the mother's current circumstances do not meet the standards of material stability that the grandmother can provide. He leaned forward. The law in this territory is clear. A mother's right to her child is not a conditional right. It can only be terminated if there is clear and convincing evidence that the mother is unfit. And I have seen no such evidence in this case. Eleanor Wright's face went pale. Caldwell shifted in his seat. Sarah Mercer has faced extraordinary hardship. She lost her husband in a violent attack. She was severely injured. She was left without resources. But she did not give up. She found shelter for herself and her daughter. She found a man who was willing to stand beside her, and she built a home. He paused. The marriage between Jack Mercer and Sarah Mercer has been scrutinized from every angle. It has been called fraudulent, convenient, and strategic. But what I saw in this courtroom was not a strategy. What I saw was a man who looked at a child in need and decided that his life, his land, and his name were worth putting on the line for her. And a woman who looked at that man and decided to trust him with everything she had left. He looked at Emma. And I saw a child who looked at both of them and knew, with the certainty that only children possess, that she was safe. He straightened. The petition for custody is denied. The marriage is recognized as valid. Custody of Emma Rose Wright remains with her mother, Sarah Mercer. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The sound of it was the same as it had been in Laramie, a single, final note that hung in the air and then faded. But this time Jack did not feel relief. He felt something else, something deeper and quieter. He felt the weight of the past weeks settle into a place where it could finally rest. Sarah was crying. She was not making a sound, but tears were streaming down her face, and she was holding Emma so tightly that Jack wondered if she would ever let go. Emma did not struggle. She wrapped her arms around her mother's neck and held on. And then she lifted her head and looked at Jack. "You said it would be okay," she said. "You were right." Jack could not speak. He reached out and put his hand on her back, and Sarah reached out and put her hand on his, and they stood together in the empty courtroom as the bailiff began to clear the room. Eleanor Wright left without a word. She walked past them with her head held high and her face frozen into an expression of cold composure. But Jack saw her hands. They were shaking. Caldwell followed her, his papers gathered hastily. The door closed behind them, and the sound of their footsteps faded down the hallway. Daniel Hoyle rose from the back row and slipped out without looking at anyone. And then they were alone. Briggs stood and gathered his folder. He looked at the three of them and allowed himself a small, tired smile. "I'll send you the final paperwork," he said. "Congratulations, Jack. Sarah." He shook Jack's hand, then Sarah's, and then he looked at Emma. "You did good, young lady." Emma nodded solemnly. "I know," she said. Briggs laughed, the first time Jack had ever heard him laugh, and walked out of the courtroom. They walked out of the courthouse into a world that had changed. The clouds were breaking. Patches of blue were opening in the gray, and the sun was falling through them in long golden shafts that lit the wet streets of Cheyenne. Emma walked between them, holding both their hands. She did not skip or run. She walked with the same steady, determined stride she always used, but there was a lightness in it now that had not been there before. They did not speak on the walk back to the boarding house. They did not need to. The silence was full of everything they could not yet put into words. They left Cheyenne that afternoon. The wagon rolled out of the city as the sun was beginning its descent, and the road stretched ahead of them, long and open and leading home. Emma fell asleep in the wagon bed within an hour, her head resting on a folded blanket, her face peaceful in a way Jack had never seen it. He looked at her and thought about the first time he had seen her, standing on a ridge with a broken branch, her eyes fierce and terrified, and full of a determination that should not have existed in a child so small. He thought about everything that had happened since then. The nights in the spare room, the mornings in the barn, the cornbread and the coffee and the curtains in the kitchen. The first time she had called him Jack instead of Mr. The first time she had fallen asleep on his horse. The way she had taken his hand in the courtroom without looking for it. Sarah was driving the wagon. She had insisted. She said she needed to do something with her hands. Jack sat beside her, and they watched the road together, and the miles passed under the wheels. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. Jack thought about it. "We go home," he said. "We fix the shed. We plant the north field. We teach Emma how to ride properly, so she stops falling off every time Biscuit sneezes." Sarah smiled. "She doesn't fall off that often. She fell off twice last week. She's learning." "I know. That's what makes it worth it." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I mean after that. After the shed is fixed. After the field is planted. After Emma can ride without falling off. What do we do then?" Jack looked at her. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains. The wind moved through the grass, and the wagon creaked beneath them. "We live," he said. "We wake up every morning and do the work. We sit on the porch in the evening and watch the sun go down. We watch Emma grow up. We figure out what kind of people we want to be, and we try to become them." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the road. "That sounds good," she said. "That sounds like enough." They reached the ranch at dusk. The house was exactly as they had left it, a shape against the darkening sky, the windows dark, the chimney cold. But as they pulled up to the yard, Jack saw something that stopped him. On the porch, leaning against the door, was a branch. It was not just any branch, it was Emma's branch. He had left it at the boarding house, propped against the wall. He looked at Emma, who was standing in the wagon bed, looking at the branch with a small, satisfied smile. "How did that get here?" he asked. "I asked Mr. Briggs to bring it," Emma said. "I told him it was important." Jack looked at the branch. It was the same broken piece of wood she had held on the ridge, the same one she had refused to drop, the same one she had kept beside her bed every night since they arrived. He had thought she had left it behind. She had not left it. She had sent it ahead. "Why?" he asked. Emma climbed down from the wagon and walked to the porch. She picked up the branch and held it for a moment, looking at it. Then she leaned it against the wall beside the door, exactly where Jack had moved it on the first night she stayed in his house. "Because this is where it belongs," she said. "It's not for fighting anymore. It's for remembering." She turned and walked into the house without looking back. Jack stood in the yard and watched her go. Sarah came and stood beside him. The last light of the day was fading, and the stars were beginning to appear, one by one, scattered across the deepening blue. "She's going to be all right," Sarah said. "I know. We're going to be all right." Jack looked at the house. The windows were dark now, but he could see a lamp being lit inside, a warm glow that spread through the kitchen and softened the edges of the evening. "Yeah," he said, "I think we are." They stood together in the cooling air, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around them. A horse stamped in the barn. A bird called from the fence line. Somewhere in the house, Emma was moving around, making herself at home in a place that had become her home. Jack thought about the hill behind the house, the cottonwood tree, the stone at its base. He would go up there tomorrow. He would tell Margaret that everything had worked out, that he had found something he had not been looking for, that he had learned that the world was not as empty as he had thought it was. He took Sarah's hand and they walked into the house together. The kitchen was warm. Emma had lit the lamp and was sitting at the table, drawing. She had drawn a picture of 4 figures this time: a man, a woman, a child, and a horse. Jack looked at it and felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that had been closed for so long he had forgotten it was there. "Can I keep this?" he asked. Emma looked at the drawing, then at him. "It's for you," she said. "I drew it for you." Jack folded the drawing carefully and put it in his pocket, next to his heart. That night, after Emma was asleep, Jack sat on the porch. The stars were out, Wyoming stars, more than a man could count. The air was cool and clean, and the world was quiet. Sarah came out and sat beside him. She did not say anything, she just sat, close enough that he could feel her warmth in the darkness. "I never thought I would have this," Jack said. "After Margaret died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my years alone, and that was just the way it was going to be." Sarah did not interrupt. "But then I found you, and I found Emma, and I realized that I had been wrong. There was more. There was always going to be more. I just couldn't see it." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. "I couldn't see it either," she said, "but I can see it now." They sat together on the porch, watching the stars, and the night wrapped around them like a blanket. The house was warm behind them. Their daughter was sleeping inside, and for the first time in a very long time, both of them were exactly where they were supposed to be. The next morning, Jack rose before dawn. He walked up the hill behind the house to the cottonwood tree. The stone was still there, half buried in the grass. He knelt beside it and placed his hand on the cool surface. "I wanted to tell you," he said. "I found them. I found a family." The wind moved through the leaves. "I think you would have liked them. I think you would have told me to stop being so stubborn and just let myself be happy." He smiled, a small and quiet smile. "I'm trying, Margaret. I'm trying." He stood and looked out at the ranch below. The house was lit with the first light of morning. Smoke was rising from the chimney. He could see Emma running toward the barn, her braids flying behind her, already shouting for biscuit. He could see Sarah standing in the kitchen doorway, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching Emma with a smile on her face. Jack walked back down the hill to his family, and the sun rose over the Wyoming plains, golden and warm, promising another day of work and love, and the slow, steady building of a life that had been rebuilt from the ground up. The branch leaned beside the door, a reminder of where they had started, but the door itself was open, and the house was full of light. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe.